800 soldiers have been eating gray porridge for 3 months now, waiting for spring. In the spring, Haldrick's army will come and kill them all. Everyone knows this. And then a dead sous chef from a Michelin-starred restaurant falls into their shed, clutching a wooden spoon. The smell hits them first: rancid lard, mouse droppings, smoke from damp firewood. Then a pain in the back of his head. Dan Khan lies face down on the dirt floor. He unclenches his fingers. A wooden spoon, blackened. The apron he's wearing isn't his, and it's covered in brown stains. Blood, not his. His own smells different. He realizes this immediately. And from above, they're already yelling. A red-faced man with a neck thicker than a thigh is spitting. Khan, porridge. The regiment's been waiting 40 minutes. I'm going to shove that ladle down your throat right now. Dan sits down. He looks around. A wooden shed, 2 cauldrons, rat tracks. Outside the door, a gray morning and tents stretching to the horizon. A military camp. A gray mass with a film of grease is bubbling in the pot. In a past life, not even a stray dog would have eaten this. And then it hits him. He died. Collapsed in the kitchen at 3 in the morning. The back of his head hit the corner of the table. After 18 hours on his feet. And now he's here. In a stranger's body. In a stranger's world. And they're demanding porridge from him. The sergeant swings again. Dan doesn't flinch. He looks at the pot. At the shriveled onion by the wall. At the little bag of white stuff in the corner. At the dark ham hanging from the ceiling. Old, but not rotten. It'll do. The sergeant doesn't strike. Something in the skinny cook's eyes stops him. Dan stands up, wipes his hands, looks the sergeant in the face and says he needs 40 minutes. The sergeant laughs, falls silent, takes a step back. 40 minutes. Dan works in silence. His hands do what they know how to do. 12 years at the stove aren't forgotten even after death. He takes down the ham, sniffs it. Cured for about 8 months. The fibers are dense. He cuts off the top layer, slices it into thin strips along the grain. That way the flavor comes out faster. He sears the onion cut side down against the side of the pot, until it turns black. Burnt onion isn't a mistake. It's depth. A smoky, sweetish note that draws everything out of the meat. The white powder turns out to be salt. Rock salt. A bit harsh, but it works. Behind the barrel, he finds a bottle. Wine. Sour. Almost vinegar. Perfect. The acidity will tenderize the fibers. He pours the gray sludge onto the ground, fills it with fresh water, throws in the meat, onions, salt, splashes in the wine, covers it with a lid, and waits. For 30 minutes he stands by the cauldron, stirring, skimming off the foam, tasting. The shed no longer smells of mice. The shed smells of real food. The scent of meat seeps out through the cracks in the walls. The first to arrive is a skinny guy with a bandaged arm. He takes a deep breath. He leaves. 5 minutes later, there are 2. 10 minutes later, 50. They don't come inside. They just stand there and sniff, like hungry dogs at a butcher's shop. There isn't enough fat. Dan finds a piece of lard on the edge. He crumbles it. He tosses it into the pot 5 minutes before it's done. The fat spreads like a film across the surface. Now the soup coats the mouth. Now it's food. The sergeant returns exactly 40 minutes later. Behind him, the formation. 800 men. The 17th Composite Regiment, their 3rd month at the pass. Their 3rd month waiting for spring, as if they were waiting for execution. Dan serves it out himself. He makes sure there's meat in every bowl, not just broth. The soldiers take their bowls and walk away. The first ones eat standing up, quickly, out of habit. Then they slow down. They stop. One sits right on the ground. A second. A third. 10 minutes later, half the regiment is sitting on the ground, eating in silence. All you can hear are spoons. The sergeant takes his bowl last. He sits down on a log, swallows, freezes, scoops up more and more. Then he lowers his spoon. Tears are streaming down his face, down his cheeks, into his beard. He doesn't wipe them away. 20 years at war, scars, friends killed. He's never cried once. And here he is, bawling over Russian soup like a little boy. And he doesn't understand why. It's not magic, not an alchemist's potion worth 1,000 gold pieces. It's meat, onions, salt, wine, and the hands of a man who knows what he's doing. The next morning, a corporal from the 1st Company arrives with strange news. The company that ate first and hot completed the day's forced march without a single straggler. For the first time this winter, usually 5 or 6 fall behind, the weakest ones. Yesterday, not a single one. The captain blamed it on the weather. Dan is silent. He knows it's not about the weather. A hot meal with protein and fat before exertion. That's the basics. First lesson in army cooking. In his world, every military cook knows this. Here, no one does. Here, a cook ranks lower than a goldsmith. Here, they feed the soldiers rotten cabbage and wonder why they're dropping dead on the march. Dan surveys the storeroom. A sack of grain, half a sack of flour, 3 onions, a chunk of lard for 2 days, for 800 men, for a week. He sits down on the floor, and for the first time allows himself to think about where he is. The world is called Erlon. The kingdom of Velenmar has been at war with the Haldric Empire for 3 years. The north has been lost. This regiment is stationed at the pass, waiting for spring. People here have ranks. Strength is measured by numbers. The more you've killed, the higher you are. A cook is a 0. Less than 0. In his past life, he was a sous chef at a Michelin-starred restaurant. He fed people who paid $200 for dinner. He made consommé as clear as a tear. He knew 14 ways to cook an egg. And he died. He slipped on grease at 3 in the morning. His last thought was of his mother, of how he never managed to make her a proper soul tang. He promised and promised. He didn't make it in time. He opens his eyes. He looks at the wall opposite and freezes. Letters are carved into the boards with a knife, not in the local language, in Korean. He stands up, runs his finger along the groove. The handwriting is familiar. That's how cooks write when they're used to signing orders quickly. That's how he writes himself. The inscription reads, "Sorry I didn't get a chance to feed you." Someone was here before him, just like him. Someone who came into this world and couldn't make it. The tree is 50 years old, maybe older. Dan sits back down. He grips the wooden spoon tighter. He doesn't know who wrote it. He doesn't know why he's here. He doesn't know if he can go back. But he knows one thing. Tomorrow morning, 800 people will come to this shed with empty bowls, and he'll feed them. The next morning, the shouting again, the sergeant again. But now Dan is ready. He gets up before dawn. He soaks the grain the night before. Grain that's been soaking cooks twice as fast. The locals don't soak anything. They toss the dry stuff into boiling water and stir until they're blue in the face. Behind the shed, he finds wild garlic, twice as sharp as Korean garlic. He crushes it with the flat side of his knife, throws it into the porridge. He melts the last of the lard on the side of the pot. He collects the cracklings in a bowl. That will go on top. Crunch. Texture. Porridge without texture is a punishment. Porridge with cracklings and garlic is breakfast. The sergeant arrives on time. He sniffs the air. He is silent. Yesterday he cried. Today he is silent. But there is something new in his silence. Something like respect. The regiment eats. Dan counts. 3 days' worth of grains. No lard, no onions, no meat. In 3 days he'll be boiling water with salt. We need food. We need an assistant who doesn't spit in the pot. Second cook Bricks cooks for the officers. He's huge, hands like ham hocks, 20 years at the cauldron, and he cooks just like everyone else, throws everything into the water, boils it to death. For 20 years he fed the regiment, and no one ever said thank you. And then some nobody came along and became the favorite for a single bowl. Bricks has hated Dan from day one. Dan can see that. But right now, he has no time for Bricks. After breakfast, he goes to the quartermaster, asks for meat. The quartermaster laughs. Meat is rationed twice a week. Want more? Write a report. They'll review it in a month. Asks for oil. The quartermaster points to a barrel in the corner. Rancid. Green. Stinks. There's no other. Asks for spices. The quartermaster looks at him at a madman. There's nothing for people to eat here. Dan walks out. He looks at the camp. Beyond it, the forest. Dark. Thick. Trees 3 men wide. Hunters go there, rarely. It's dangerous. Monsters. But in the forest, there's meat. Fresh. And herbs. And mushrooms. And berries. Everything a kitchen needs if it wants to be a kitchen and not a torture chamber. Dan finds a piece of charcoal. On the back of a sack, he writes a list of what needs to be found in this world so that 800 people can survive until spring. The list is long. There's no money at all. But Dan knows one thing this world hasn't figured out yet. A hungry soldier is a dead soldier. And a dead soldier won't win a war. And sooner or later, someone up there will figure that out. By evening, the first one arrives. That skinny guy with the bandaged arm. He's fidgeting by the door. About 17. A recruit. The bandage is dirty. The wound is inflamed. He says his name is Turney. He says that yesterday, after the soup, he felt warm. Not on the outside, on the inside. He can't remember the last time he felt warm inside. Dan looks at his arm, at his face. Thin, gray, sunken eyes. This guy hasn't eaten properly in months. His body took calories from that slop and nothing else. No warmth, no strength, no reason to live. Dan nods, tells him to come back in the morning. Turney leaves. Dan touches the wall. Letters under his fingers. Sorry I didn't get a chance to feed you. Whoever carved this inscription knew. Food isn't just calories. Food is a way to tell a person they exist. That someone took the time to cook just for them. That they're not just another mouth to feed. That they're alive. In a world where strength is measured by rank and a cook is worth less than a goldsmith, this knowledge is worth more than any sword. Third day in the kitchen and the grain is gone. Dan stood over the empty sack and counted. The lard ran out yesterday. There had been no onions since day one. There was still flour, but you can't make porridge from flour without fat and eggs. Only flatbreads. Gray, bland. Just like everything else in this camp. He stepped out of the shed. It was a cold morning. Cane Pass. Doll Pass stood in the fog. Down below, the camp was waking up. Soldiers were walking to the latrines, coughing, spitting. Half of them wore rags instead of boots. It was the third year of the war with Haldrick, and the kingdom of Velenmar was squeezing every last drop out of its people. The generals were slashing the budget for everything that wasn't weapons. There are swords, no meat. There are arrows, no oil. The logic of a war in which soldiers are expendable material, not human beings. Dan knew this logic. It wasn't like that in the Korean army. There, they were fed. Poorly, but they were fed. Here, they were fed as if they wanted to kill their own men before the enemy did. He headed toward the forest. Not into the forest itself, to the edge, where the trees were still thin and the ground was still soft. He was searching, not knowing exactly what, but knowing that the ground near the forest always yields something. He found it 20 minutes later, a wild root, pale, long, resembling a parsnip. He dug it up with his hands, sniffed it. An earthy smell, slightly sweet, with a hint of bitterness when broken. He bit off a piece, starchy, dense, slightly sharp on the tongue. You can cook this. You can grate it and make flatbreads. You can dry it for the winter. He dug up 7 more. Then he found a bunch of something resembling wild garlic. Then a mushroom on a tree trunk, big, flat, smells like the forest and just a hint of pepper. He cut it off with a knife and sniffed it again. Not poisonous. At least it doesn't smell like it's poisonous. He took a bite, waited, chewed, swallowed. 10 minutes later, he hadn't died. 20 minutes later, his stomach wasn't. It's good. He returned with his hands full. Brix was standing by the shed, arms crossed, face red. An officer stood next to him, short, a stern mouth. Lieutenant Hollis. Dan knew his name but didn't know him. Hollis was a 5th-level fencer, from the impoverished nobility. Those are the most dangerous in war, because they have nothing to lose but their pride, and they have enough pride for 10 men. Brix wrote a report, the first of many. The content was simple. The new cook was breaking the rules. He's using unaccounted-for ingredients. He's pouring out government-issued porridge. He's wasting wine reserves meant for the officers' table. Hollis looked down at Dan. Literally, he was a head taller. He asked what was in his hands. Dan showed him the roots and mushrooms. Hollis asked where they came from. Dan said from the edge of the forest. Hollis asked who had given him permission to leave the camp. Dan said he didn't know he needed permission to feed the soldiers. Hollis flushed. Brix smirked. Dan stood straight. He didn't talk back. He didn't apologize. He just stood there with the roots in his hands and waited. Hollis said that one more time leaving without permission, and the cook would be sent to the guardhouse. He turned and walked away. Brix spat at Dan's feet. He left too. Dan went into the shed. He put the roots on the table. He washed them, he peeled them, and he began to cook. He grated the root on a coarse grater, mixed it with the leftover flour, added water. It turned into dough, heavy, dense. He rolled it out and cut it into strips. He fried them on the side of the pot without oil. The root released its starch, and the strips formed a crust, soft on the inside, crispy on the outside. He sliced the mushroom thinly, very thinly, and fried it separately. When heated, the mushroom released juice, dark, fragrant, with that very peppery note. Dan tasted it and froze. Umami, the pure 5th taste. This mushroom was like a storehouse of glutamate. In his world, mushrooms like these would be worth a fortune. Here, they grew on trees at the edge of the forest and nobody wanted them. He collected the juice, poured it over the flatbreads, added wild garlic, topped it with mushroom slices. It turned into a dish. Simple, made from nothing, made from what was lying underfoot. But it smelled so good that even Dan's stomach growled. The regiment ate in silence, just like yesterday, just like the day before. But today the silence was different, not one of surprise, one of habit. They were already expecting it. In 2 days, 800 people had grown accustomed to the idea that food could actually be food. And now they came not because they had to. They came because they wanted to. That's dangerous. Dan understood that. Expectation is dangerous. If he couldn't give them that tomorrow, the disappointment would be worse than if he'd never started. They needed food, regularly, reliably. Not roots from the forest edge, but meat and fat and greens. They needed a source. He was thinking about that when Corporal, the one from the 1st platoon, his name was Greer, a pockmarked face, a heavy gaze. Greer said that after yesterday's breakfast, for the first time in a month, no one in the company had gone to the medic with stomach trouble. Not a single one. And before that, every day 3 or 4 with cramps. From the gruel. From the army gruel that killed slower than a sword, but more surely. Greer looked at Dan. He asked what you needed. Dan answered quickly. Meat. Fresh. Any kind. Fat. Vegetables. Real salt, not that junk from a bag. And at least one person in the kitchen who knows how to hold a knife the right way. Greer nodded and left. By evening, a carcass lay by the shed. A mountain hare, the size of a dog. Greer had hunted it himself. 3 hours in the woods, right at the edge. He took a risk. In the dark forest, there were things that even veterans ran from. But Greer brought back a hare. He set it by the door, said there'd be more tomorrow. Then he left. Dan looked at the carcass. Fresh, still warm. The blood hadn't clotted yet. He took a knife, the only knife in the kitchen. Dull, rusty, short. In his past life, he wouldn't have peeled a potato with a knife like that. But there was no other. He butchered the hare. Slowly, carefully. He separated the meat from the bones. The bones went into the broth. The meat went into the brine. The liver separately. The heart separately. He gathered the fat into a bowl. He didn't throw anything away. In this world, you can't throw anything away. Every piece is life. When he was done, his hands were covered in blood up to his elbows. He washed them, sat down by the fire, and began to cook the broth. The broth made from the bones of a mountain hare simmered all night. Dan didn't sleep. He sat by the pot, stoked the fire, skimmed the scum. He tasted it every half hour. By 4 in the morning, the broth had turned golden, clear, thick with collagen. It smelled like nothing else in this camp, like home, like a kitchen where someone is waiting for you for dinner. Dan closed his eyes. He inhaled the steam. For a second, he was home, in Seoul, in his mother's kitchen. His mother stood at the stove, stirring her ever-present kimchi jjigae. She was saying something about how he'd lost weight again. A second passed. He opened his eyes. The barracks, war, a foreign world, the pot, broth. 800 people who would come for breakfast in 3 hours. He stood up, stretched. His back ached. His knees throbbed. The body felt foreign and weak. The body of the previous Danhan, the local one, the one who had worn this apron before him. He didn't know what had happened to that man. He'd probably died, just like he had. 2 cooks, 2 bodies, 1 name. Coincidence or not, he didn't know. But there was no time to think about it. In the morning, he served broth. Just broth. Hot, golden, with wild greens on top. The soldiers drank it from bowls like tea. It warmed their hands. It warmed their insides. Turney, that very recruit, came first. His hand was healing. The bandage was cleaner. He sat by the shed and drank the broth in small sips. He closed his eyes. He sat like that for 10 minutes. Then he stood up. Thanks, he said to the cook. He left. Dan watched him go. 17 years old, at war, with a festering wound, drinking bone broth from a bowl and saying thank you. In his old world, 17-year-olds chose between Starbucks and bubble tea. Here they choose between gray porridge and death. And now between broth and gray porridge. Not much to choose from, but it's a start. Greer came by in the afternoon, 2 others with him, burly guys from the 3rd platoon. They silently set a sack down by the shed, turnips inside, local, pale, with a strange bluish tint, moon turnips. Dan cut one open, white flesh with purple streaks. He sniffed, slightly sweet, earthy, dense. He boiled a piece, tasted it, good, starchy, Sweet. Texture like a sweet potato. He could work with this. He sliced it thinly, fried the slices until crispy. Then he tossed them into the remaining broth. Added the hare meat, wild garlic, a pinch of salt. Simmered for an hour over low heat. The turnip absorbed the broth and became silky. The meat gave up its fibers and dissolved into the soup. It turned into a stew. Thick, heavy, filling. It tasted like something between Korean chamchi and French pot au feu. Dan ate alone. For the first time in 3 days, he ate with pleasure. Not because he was hungry, because it was delicious. On the 4th day, Brix came to see him. Not to report him, just to talk. He stood in the doorway, red-faced, sweaty, hands clenched into fists. He said Dan was meddling in things that weren't his business, that the kitchen had been running for 20 years, that there was a system, that if every cook started making things up, tomorrow the soldiers would demand dessert, and the day after tomorrow they'd refuse to fight without wine. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. Brix talked for 10 minutes, then he fell silent. He was breathing heavily. He waited for a response. Dan said one thing. Try it. He took a bowl, poured some stew into it, set it down in front of Brix. Brix stared at the bowl, at the stew, at Dan. His face twitched. For 20 years he'd been cooking his porridge. For 20 years no one had complained, because there was nothing to complain about. Everyone cooked it that way. Everyone ate it that way. It was the norm. And then this guy showed up. Skinny, strange, silent. And he broke the norm in 3 days. Brix sat down. He picked up a spoon, scooped some up, ate it, froze, scooped some more, finished it, put down the bowl, stood up, looked at Dan. There was something broken in his eyes. Not anger, not hatred, something worse. The realization that 20 years of his work had been nothing, that he had been feeding people not food but punishment, and hadn't known it. Brix left without saying a word. The next morning he wrote a second denunciation, longer than the first. Dan wasn't surprised. Admitting that you're a nobody hurts more than hating the one who showed you that. On the 7th day, Dan set out the first fermentation pots. 3 clay jugs that Greer had traded to a wagon driver for a card debt. Dan washed them. He scorched them over the fire. He found 2 sacks of coarse salt in the storeroom. He sliced the moon turnip into thin strips. He rubbed it with salt. He added wild garlic. Wild pepper he found on the 2nd day by the stream. And a handful of those very same peppery mushrooms, finely chopped. He layered them, packed them down, poured in the brine, covered them with lids, weighed them down with stones on top. In 2 weeks, he'll have kimchi. Not Korean, Iranian, made from local ingredients using Korean technology. Fermentation is time. Time is flavor. A flavor that can't be achieved any other way. Local cooks didn't ferment anything. They salted meat so it wouldn't go bad. They pickled cabbage so they wouldn't have to throw it away. But they did it without understanding, without control, without a purpose. Dan did it with a purpose. Every pot was calculated. Temperature, amount of salt, aging time. He didn't write it down. He kept it in his head. 30 years of culinary experience is a library you can't burn. That same day, he drove out the rats. Not with magic, not with poison, with cleanliness. He took everything out of the barn. All the utensils, all the sacks, all the barrels. He scraped the floor, the walls, the ceiling. With his hands, a knife, a rag from an old shirt. He washed the cracks with boiling water. He scattered ashes from the hearth in the corners. Rats can't stand lie. Every peasant in his world knew that. Here, no one knew. Turney helped. The boy came by every day now. His hand was healing. The bandage was clean. He didn't say much. He just stood by and did what he was told. Carried water, chopped wood, cleaned the pots. Didn't complain. Didn't ask why. Just stood by. Dan didn't have to push him. A first mate who didn't need to be told that the kitchen had to be clean. A rarity in any world. Hollis arrived on the 8th day, not alone, with 2 soldiers. He stood in the middle of the kitchen. He looked around. Clean. Pots against the wall, pots gleaming. The floor scraped clean. Meat hanging on hooks, properly. Separate from the vegetables, separate from the flour. Hollis frowned. He'd expected a mess. He'd expected a reason to punish someone. There was no reason. He looked at Dan, asked where the meat came from. Dan replied that hunters from the regiment hunted it in their spare time. Hollis asked with whose permission. Dan replied that Corporal Greer was coordinating it. Hollis asked if the captain knew. Dan remained silent. Hollis understood. The captain didn't know. There was his excuse. Hollis said that unauthorized procurement was a violation of the regulations, that food supplies had to go through the quartermaster's office, that the cook had no right to form his own supply network, that this was a mutiny in the making. Dan stood there and listened. Hollis was right. According to the regulations, to the letter. According to the logic of a world where a cook is a nobody and a fifth-grade lieutenant is the law. But Dan knew a different logic. Spring would begin in 2 weeks. In a month, Haldrick's army would arrive. This regiment would be the first to face the onslaught. 800 men against thousands. And the only thing separating them from their grave is how they eat these next 2 weeks. He didn't tell Hollis that. It was useless. Hollis didn't listen to cooks. He heard only the clang of swords. The regimental captain saved the day. Wren, short, gray-haired. His left arm wouldn't bend at the elbow. An old wound. 9th rank. Once upon a time, that was a lot. Now, after 3 years of war, level 9 meant you were simply alive. Wren came to the kitchen in the evening. No entourage, no officers, alone. He stood by the door. He looked at Dan, said he'd heard, that Greer had told him, that the first company hadn't lost a single sick man in a week, that no one had fallen behind on the marches, that for the first time this winter, the soldiers weren't stealing from the supply train because they had enough. Wren looked at the pots against the wall, at the meat on the hooks, at the clean floor, and he asked the cook's name. Dan said his name was Khan. Wren nodded. He was silent for a moment. Then he said that Lieutenant Hollis was withdrawing his report, that the quartermaster would be instructed to allocate an additional ration from the reserve to the kitchen. Not much, but at least something. Wren turned around. He stopped at the door. Without turning around, he said that the pass must be held, that things would be bad in the spring, that he needed living soldiers, not heroes, and he left. Dan stood in silence. It was the first time an officer higher in rank than a corporal had looked at the cook as a human being. That night, Dan didn't sleep. He sat by the wall with the inscription. He traced the letters. I'm sorry I didn't get to feed you. Who are you? What were you cooking? For whom? Why didn't you make it in time? They killed you. That's what he sensed. He didn't know. He felt it. The one who carved those letters had been killed. Because in a world where power is a rank and a cook is a nobody, a man who makes soldiers stronger with food is a threat. Not to the enemy, to those at the top. To the generals who command the hungry, because the hungry are more obedient. To the quartermasters who steal provisions and sell them on the side. To the alchemists who sell potions for 1,000 gold pieces, and here some cook is doing the same thing with roots and mushrooms. Dan closed his eyes. He understood. In his past world, too, they killed those who changed the rules. Not with a knife, with the system. With firings, with debts, with scandals. Here it's simpler. Here it's a knife. He wasn't afraid. Not because he was brave, because he had already died once. The second time isn't so scary. It's scarier not to make it in time. The 9th day. In the morning, Dan was baking flatbreads in mountain hare fat. A man he'd never seen before wandered into the kitchen. Not young. A beard streaked with gray. Eyes red from lack of sleep. Hands stained. Old stains. Brown. Blood and herbs. The regimental medic, Ha-Yun Kim. She took off her hood, and Dan saw it wasn't a beard, not a man, a woman, slender, emaciated, with dark circles under her eyes like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. The only female doctor for 40 miles. She had sat over the wounded soldier for 3 nights. The soldier was dying, a wound in his stomach from an arrow. No medicine, no clean bandages, no medicine. Ha-Yun simply held his hand because there was nothing else she could do to help. The soldier died at dawn. She came into the kitchen, not for food, she just came, because the kitchen smelled of life and the infirmary smelled of death. Dan looked at her. He didn't ask, he didn't sympathize. He set a bowl of broth, that very one. 18 hours of simmering, bones from the hare that Greer had brought the day before yesterday. Clear, golden, hot, with a sprig of wild greens on top. Ha-Yun looked at the bowl. She didn't move. Dan turned away toward the pot. He didn't look. He gave her time. He heard her pick up the spoon. He heard her scoop some up. He heard the silence for a few seconds. Then he heard her breathing, uneven, heavy. She was crying, silently, over the bowl, like a sergeant on the first day. Dan didn't turn around. He washed the pot. He cut the turnip. He pretended to be busy. 15 minutes later, Ha-Yun finished the broth. She set the bowl on the table. She stood up. She walked over to Dan. She looked him straight in the eye. Her eyes were red. Her cheeks were wet. She said she had 11 wounded in the infirmary, 3 in critical condition. that she had no potions and wouldn't get any until the next supply train, that she couldn't save them, that the broth she'd just drunk was the first warmth she hadn't had to pay for in all her time at the front. Then she asked, could he, for those three, do something? Anything at all? Dan looked at her, nodded, said he needed to know what was wrong with each one, where the wound was, how much blood they'd lost, if they had a fever, if they could eat on their own. Ha-Yun started talking and couldn't stop. Professional, precise. Diagnosis, prognosis, condition. 3 wounded, 3 stories, 3 bodies dying in different ways. Dan listened, memorized. He wasn't a doctor. He was a cook. But he knew that a body fighting a wound needed certain things. Protein for tissue repair, fat for energy, fluids for blood, warmth for the spirit. He could provide all of that, not with medicine, with food. All day long he cooked separately, 3 pots, 3 dishes. For the first wounded man with a laceration on his leg, a thick meat soup in a rich broth with turnips and wild garlic. Lots of protein, lots of fat, heavy food for a body that spends everything on healing. For the second, with fever and inflammation, a light, clear broth, almost water, but with herbs from the stream that smelled of mint and were slightly bitter. You can't feed a fever with heavy food. A fever needs to be quenched with something warm and clear. For the third, the most seriously injured one, who hadn't eaten on his own for 3 days, a completely liquid broth, with a pinch of salt, with a drop of honey that Turney found in a hollow at the edge of the forest and brought in the morning with his face swollen from bee stings. A drop of honey in the broth. It's not medicine. It's a plea to the body not to give up. In the evening, Ha-Yun took the pots, silently. She nodded. She left. Dan didn't know if those 3 would survive, didn't know if it would help, but he knew he'd done the only thing he knew how to do. 3 days later, Ha-Yun came again, at 3 in the morning. Dan wasn't asleep. He was making broth for tomorrow. She stood in the doorway. Her eyes were burning. 2 of the 3 were on the mend. The worst off is pulling through. He's on his own. He's asking for more. Ha-Yun looked at Dan, at his hands, burned by the pot, at his face, gray from lack of sleep, at his apron, stained brown with blood and grease, and she said she wanted to learn, that in 20 years at war, she'd seen that medicines heal the body, but she hadn't seen anything that healed the will to live, and his food healed exactly that. Dan replied briefly, "Come in the morning. I'll show you how to chop onions." The second week, Ha-Yun came every morning before dawn. Dan taught her in silence. He didn't explain why. He showed her with his hands. Hold the knife like this. Don't grip it. Keep your hand relaxed. The knife does the work, not you. Index finger on the heel, thumb on the side, 3 fingers on the handle. Ha-Yun repeated the steps. Her hands were precise. 20 years of surgery. She knew how to cut, just not food. On the 3rd day, she sliced the moon turnip thinner than Dan had on his first day. He nodded. He didn't praise her out loud, but she understood. Ha-Yun didn't ask questions. She watched. She memorized. 2 masters of different crafts who spoke the same language, the language of precision. On the 10th day, the first shipment arrived from the supply train. Captain Wren kept his word. A sack of flour, half a sack of grain, a barrel of oil, not rancid, normal, yellow, thick. Dan opened the lid and closed his eyes. The butter smelled like butter. For the first time in 10 days, there was fat in his kitchen that he could work with, not fight against. He melted a spoonful in the pan, tossed in a piece of meat. It sizzled. The smell was so strong that Turney, standing at the door, swallowed audibly. Dan smiled, for the first time in 2 weeks. He began frying the meat in batches, not all at once, in small portions, so the pan would stay hot. So the meat wouldn't stew in its own juices but would actually fry. A crust, caramelization, the Maillard reaction. Sugars and amino acids meet at high temperatures and create that very taste and aroma that makes people's mouths water. On Erlon, no one knew about this. They threw the meat into the pot raw. They boiled it for hours. The result was a gray rag. Dan seared it until it was crispy and then braised it. The difference was like that between sand and silk. By lunchtime, the camp was so that soldiers from the neighboring 9th Regiment, stationed a mile to the south, sent a messenger to ask what was burning. Dan didn't answer. He was portioning out the food. Braised meat in a thick sauce. A sauce made from broth, butter, and peppery mushrooms. Flour flatbreads fried until crisp. And a handful of fermented turnips from the pots. 10 days in brine. Too soon. Ideally, it needs 2 weeks. But he tasted it that morning and decided it would do. Sour, crunchy, with a garlicky aroma and a slight burn on the tongue. Not kimchi, but something close. Something that makes your mouth come alive and beg for more. The regiment ate, and this time, the silence gave way to something else. Conversation. Quiet. Between spoonfuls. The soldiers were talking, not about the war, about the food. For the first time in months, they were discussing the taste. One said the meat reminded him of the roast his grandmother used to make in the village before the war. Another said the sour turnip was like that pickled root they sold at the fair in Tunnel Creek. A third simply said it was delicious. 3 words. Delicious. It's delicious here. Dan heard and remained silent, but inside something gave way. These men began to remember. The food brought back memories of life before the war, of homes, of families, of childhood flavors. A hungry soldier doesn't remember why he lives. A well-fed one remembers. After lunch, Hayun approached Dan. With her was a person he didn't know. A thin girl in a uniform that was 2 sizes too big for her. Red hair pulled back into a short ponytail. Her face was sharp, angry. Her eyes were green and wild. Her hands were covered in small burns. Not from the kitchen, from magic. Hayun said this was Aislinn Ver, a warrior, the top student at the regimental academy, sent to the front lines early, 19 years old. Aislinn stood there and looked at Dan as if he were a cockroach, another cook. Hayun said she hadn't brought her here for no reason, that Aislinn burns through essence faster than she can replenish it, that after every battle she throws up bile, that she's walking a tightrope and one day won't come back. Aislinn flinched. She snapped at Hayun that it was none of her business, that she was fine, that she didn't need a healer, and certainly didn't need a cook. She turned and walked away. Dan didn't follow her, didn't call out to her, didn't try to talk her out of it. He asked Hayun what happens to a mage's body when the essence burns out. Hayun explained. Essence is like internal fat, fuel for magic. When a mage spends more than they have, the body starts burning itself. Muscles, fat reserves, then organs. Vomiting bile is a sign that the liver can't keep up. If it continues, the heart. Dan listened, nodded, thought. A body that burns itself needs 2 things. Fat, to provide an alternative fuel, and bitterness, to get the liver working again. Fatty fish and bitter herbs. In his world, that's how they feed people after prolonged starvation. Not heavy food, fat and bitterness. So the body remembers how to process energy instead of devouring itself. That evening he found Aislinn, not in the kitchen, behind the shed. She was sitting on the ground, hugging herself. She was shaking. Her lips were white. Her eyes were closed. She'd just been vomiting, a yellow stain on the ground nearby. Bile. Dan approached silently, sat down beside her, not too close, set a bowl in front of her, a small one, fish from the stream. Greer had caught 3 that morning, small, bony, but fatty. Turney had spent an hour cleaning them. Dan had stewed them with bitter herbs from the stream and a sour sauce made from fermented turnips. The result was a pungent dish, not tasty in the usual sense. Bitter and fatty and sour all at once, contradictory, like medicine that burns your throat but heals you. Aislinn opened her eyes. She looked at the bowl. She looked at Dan. She said she wasn't a hungry dog. Dan nodded. He said she wasn't a dog. But her body was burning, and in a month there would be nothing left to burn. Aislinn was silent. Then she picked up the bowl. She sniffed it. She grimaced. She took a bite of fish. She chewed it. She swallowed. She froze. She took another bite, and another. She ate half of it. She set it aside. She sat there for a minute. Then she finished it, silently. Then she threw up again, but not bile, just the urge to vomit. Empty. Her body was trying to reject the food and couldn't because the fat had already started to be absorbed. Aislinn wiped her mouth, looked at Dan, said it was disgusting. Dan replied that it would taste better tomorrow. She stood up, left. She didn't say thank you. She didn't curse. She just left. Dan washed the bowl. He knew she'd come back tomorrow. She didn't come tomorrow. She came 2 days later, at night, after combat training where she nearly fainted from overusing essence. She came into the kitchen, stood in the doorway, said one word, give. Dan didn't ask what. He set down the bowl. Fish, bitter herbs, sour sauce, the same thing. She ate quickly, greedily, Not like someone enjoying a meal, but like someone drowning and gasping for air. She finished, sat for a moment, stood up. This time she didn't throw up. She looked at her hands. The burns had faded. The trembling had stopped. The essence was recovering. Slowly, but it was recovering. She looked at Dan. There was something like rage in her eyes, but not at him, at herself. At the fact that she needed the cook's help. She, the Academy's top student, a combat mage, a future fourth-level mage, in need of fatty fish and bitter herbs from some cook. She said she hated it. Dan replied that hatred drains essence too. Better to eat. Aislinn snorted, turned away. She stopped at the door. Without turning around, she asked if there would be more tomorrow. Dan said there would be. She left. Dan washed the bowl and thought. 2 of the 3 critically wounded had started to recover from his broth. The battle mage was restoring essence from his fish. The company wasn't losing any sick soldiers from his breakfasts. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't just tasty food. Something happened when he cooked for a specific person. Something more than chemistry and temperature. He didn't know exactly what, but he felt it in his hands. When he cut the fish for Aislinn, his hands knew instinctively which piece to take, how thick to cut it, which side to put on the heat, as if the food itself was telling him what this body needed, this soul, this fear. It was frightening, and at the same time, it was the most right thing he'd felt since he woke up in the barn. The 12th day, morning. Dan was checking the fermentation pots when he heard a scream. Beyond the camp, on the northern slope. Alarm, bugle. The regiment was up in a minute. Haldrick's reconnaissance. A cavalry detachment, 30 riders, testing the pass's defenses. Not a real attack, a probing strike, seeing where the weak spots are. The battle lasted an hour. The 17th Regiment held its ground. 6 casualties, 3 killed, 3 wounded. Dan stood in the barn and listened to the sounds of battle. Shouts, clanging, horses neighing, then silence, then moans, then footsteps. The wounded were being carried to the infirmary. Dan couldn't help in battle. He didn't know how. It wasn't his place. His place was here, by the cauldron. He stoked the fire, put the water on, started cooking. An hour later, it was ready. Soup, thick, meaty, with turnips and garlic and peppery mushrooms. Hot, steaming. He carried the pot to the entrance of the infirmary, set it down, bowls and spoons nearby, silently. Ha-Yun peeked out of the infirmary. She saw the pot. She looked at Dan. She nodded. The wounded were served first. Then the soldiers who had returned from the front lines, cold, drenched in sweat, with blood on their hands, their own and others. They ate standing up, silently, spoonful by spoonful, and they warmed up, not from the soup, from the fact that someone had already been cooking for them while they were fighting, that the rear was working, that the kitchen was waiting. Captain Wren walked by. He looked at the pot, at the ladle, at Dan in his brown apron. He said nothing, but he remembered. 2 weeks at the pass, the fermentation pots were ready. Dan opened the first one in the morning. The smell hit his nose, sour, sharp, alive. In 14 days, the turnip had become something else, not a raw vegetable, not boiled porridge. Something with character, with depth, with that very aftertaste that Koreans call kamchidamat, the taste of maturity, the taste of patience. Dan tasted it. He closed his eyes. Almost kimchi. Not quite, but close. Close enough for his mouth to say yes. He divided it into bowls. A little. A handful of fermented turnip with each serving of morning porridge. The soldiers tasted it. They grimaced. Unfamiliar, sour, spicy. Then they tried some more. Then they asked for seconds. By lunchtime, the first pot was empty. Dan set out a new one, with a double portion. On Erlen, they didn't ferment food for the taste, only for preservation. The idea that time could be an ingredient didn't exist here. Now it did. On the 15th day, what Dan had been waiting for, and fearing, happened. Brix came to the kitchen, not alone, with 3 cooks from the officers' mess. 4 burly men. Brix said enough was enough, that Chef Khan was overstepping his bounds, that the officers' mess was going without proper supplies because the entire reserve was being used for the skinny rookie's whims, that the quartermaster was complaining, that Lieutenant Hollis agreed, that the cooks would settle this among themselves, without the officers, the old-fashioned way. Dan understood. The old way meant fists. He stood before 4 men, each of whom was twice his size. The previous Khan's body had been weak, thin, without muscle, without rank, without a single seal. In a fair fight, he wouldn't have stood a chance even against one. Against 4, all the more so. Turney stepped forward. He stood next to Dan, skinny, 17 years old. his arm still in a bandage. But he stood. Greer stepped up behind him, silently, arms down but fists clenched. The third to approach was a soldier whose name Dan didn't know, from the second company, the very one who'd said the meat tasted like Grandma's roast. A fourth joined them, then a fifth, and a sixth. Within a minute, 12 men stood behind Dan. Soldiers, not cooks, not officers. Men he'd fed for 2 weeks, who'd eaten his soup after the battle, who'd remembered the taste of home. They stood in silence. They didn't threaten him. They didn't shout. They just stood there. Brix looked at them, at 12 pairs of eyes. His cooks weren't paid to fight with soldiers. Brix spat. He said this wasn't over yet. He turned and walked away. Dan stood and watched them go. Then he turned to Turney, to Greer, to the rest. He didn't say anything. He nodded. He went back to the cauldron. Dinner wouldn't cook itself. But the problem hadn't gone away. It had gotten worse. Hollis summoned Dan to his tent that evening, the lieutenant's tent, spotless, a sword on a stand, a map on the table. Hollis sat at the table and looked at Dan as if he were an insect. He said that the cook was forming a group of loyal soldiers around him, that this was a breach of the chain of command, that command of the regiment was exercised through the officer corps, not through the kitchen, that if Cook Han wanted to command, he should take a sword and go to the front lines, and if he didn't want to let him cook porridge and stay out of it. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. Hollis spoke at length and precisely. Every word was correct from the standpoint of the regulations, and every word was foolish from the standpoint of survival. Dan replied with a single sentence, that he wasn't in command. He fed people. Hollis slammed his fist on the table. He said it was all the same, and Dan thought that Hollis was right, and that Hollis understood this better than Dan himself. At night, he thought. He sat in the shed by the cold hearth. Hollis is right. Food is power. In any world, in any army, whoever feeds the troops holds the power. Dan didn't want power. He wanted to cook. But in a world where a cook is a nobody and soldiers are ready to fight for their cook, that's already politics. That's already a threat. For Hollis, for Brix, for everyone higher up the ladder than the cook, a ladder that here determines who is a man and who is not. He needs to be more careful. He needs to give Hollis no excuse. And at the same time, he can't stop doing what he does. Because in 2 weeks, spring will come, and with it, Haldrick. On the 16th day, a supply train arrived at the camp. A small one. 2 wagons. A month's worth of provisions. Flour. Groats. Salted meat. Butter. And she arrived with the supply train. Dan saw her as he was unloading the sacks. A woman in an officer's uniform. Young. Straight back. Short black hair. A face like a painting. Precise lines. Not a single superfluous feature. Dark eyes. Attentive. She looked at the camp like someone who memorizes everything they see. Sona Ryu, an observer lieutenant from headquarters. Dan found out later, from Greer. Headquarters had sent an inspection. Rumors about the 17th Regiment had reached the capital. Not about battles, about food. A regiment where no one gets sick, no one falls behind on marches, no one steals from the supply train. A regiment where soldiers want to eat and aren't afraid. Someone up top had noticed the numbers. Someone asked a question. They sent an observer to figure it out, to report, to decide what to do. Sona Ryu was that observer. She appeared in the kitchen that very first evening. She stood by the door. She watched silently as Dan prepared dinner. He could feel her gaze, professional, cold, appraising. She didn't ask questions, didn't comment, just watched. His hands, the knife, the pot, the order in the pantry, the fermentation jars. Terney, who was carrying water. At Hayun, who was slicing turnips with a surgeon's precision. Son-Ah saw everything. She memorized everything. Dan worked as usual. He didn't show off. He didn't hide anything. He just cooked. If she was from headquarters, let her watch. Food doesn't lie. Dinner. The regiment ate. Sun-Ah received her portion in the general line, like everyone else. Meat stew with moon turnips and fermented vegetables. Bread with a crispy crust. Broth in a separate bowl. She sat apart from everyone else, on a log at the edge of the clearing. Dan noticed how she was eating, evenly, methodically, spoonful by spoonful, identical portions, the same rhythm. She ate exactly as much as she was supposed to and not a drop more. Not because she didn't want to, because she was used to it. Used to eating by the book, by the numbers, without excess, without the right to seconds. That's how children who grew up hungry eat, who know that if they take more, someone else won't have enough, who have learned not to want. Dan saw this, just as he'd seen Aishlin behind the barn, just as he'd seen Ha-Yun over an empty bowl, just as he'd seen Turney with his bandaged arm. He saw people, not by their titles, not by their status, by their bodies, by their hunger. by their fear, by what lay hidden behind straight backs and precise movements. On the third day, he set a small pot in front of her, in the morning, before breakfast. She came into the kitchen as usual, to watch. She stood by the door. Dan silently placed a small clay pot with a lid in front of her. She opened it. Porridge. Rice. Or rather, made from a local grain that was cooked like rice. Soft, warm, with honey, with a piece of dried wild fruit that Turney had found on the southern slope and that looked like an apricot. Sweet, warm, just like a mother makes for her daughter when she's sick. Suna looked at the pot, at the porridge, at the honey, at the piece of fruit, then at Dan. Her face didn't change, her eyes didn't change, nothing flinched. She sat down, took a spoon, scooped some up, brought it to her mouth, ate it, froze. 10 minutes. She sat for 10 minutes over the pot and didn't move. Spoon in her hand, eyes downcast. Dan didn't look, didn't approach. He was cutting meat for breakfast for the regiment. He waited. After 10 minutes, she began to eat, slowly, each spoonful separately, as if she were counting, as if she were memorizing it. She finished. She set the bowl on the table. She stood up. She walked over to Dan. Her voice was steady, quiet. She asked who had taught him to cook such porridge. Dan replied that it was his mother. Sona paused. Then she asked for the recipe. Dan said, grain, water, honey, and thyme. She nodded. She left. But that day she didn't observe. She went to her tent and didn't come out until evening. Greer said a messenger had brought her paper for a report to headquarters. She didn't take it. The 17th day, morning, fog, cold. Dan was cooking breakfast when Captain Wren walked in. Not alone. With Hollis. With another officer Dan didn't know. Their faces were serious. Wren said that intelligence had reported it. Haldrick had moved the vanguard. 5,000. Heading for the pass. In 3 to 4 weeks, they'll be here. The 17th Regiment will take the first blow. 800 against 5,000. Wren looked at Dan. For a long time. Then he said the cook needed to get ready. That for the next month, the kitchen would matter just as much as the swords. Hollis stood nearby and said nothing. His face was stony. He didn't agree. He would never agree that a cook could be equal to a warrior, but he had seen the numbers. He had seen that the regiment wasn't getting sick, that their marching endurance had increased, that after the skirmish with the scouts, recovery took a day instead of 3. He couldn't argue with the numbers, only remain silent. Dan nodded. 3 or 4 weeks. That's both too little and too much at the same time. Too little to turn 800 half-starved soldiers into an army. Too much to give them the one thing he could. Warmth in their bellies, strength in their legs, the memory that they're being waited for, that there's a place to return to, that behind them, a fire burns under the cauldron and the smell of food fills the air. He began to count. Supplies, food, what we have, what we don't have. We need more meat, more fat, more salt. We need herbs for the wounded. We need honey for the mages. We need oil. We need flour. We need people for the kitchen. Turney can't handle it alone. Ha Yun is busy in the infirmary. We need someone who can go into the forest. A hunter. A real one. Not Greer, who risks his life for a hare. Someone who knows the dark forest. Someone who can bring back what isn't in the supply train. In the evening, he went out to the edge of the camp. He stood at the forest. Dark. Vast. Trees 3 men could barely encircle. Fog between the trunks. It smelled of dampness and something else. Something alive, animal, dangerous. This forest had everything his kitchen needed. Meat, herbs, mushrooms, berries, roots, and everything that could kill whoever entered. Monsters, beasts. A nameless creature that came out at night, and for which the sentries kept bonfires burning all night long. Dan stood there and thought. He needed this forest. The forest that would kill him. He needed a guide, someone who lives between the camp and the forest, someone who knows the trails. He returned to the shed, sat down against the wall, closed his eyes. 3 weeks. 5,000 of Haldrick's soldiers, 800 men in his regiment, 1 cook, 1 cauldron, and the inscription on the wall. Sorry, I didn't get a chance to feed you. Dan opened his eyes. He looked at the inscription. The one who wrote this didn't make it. He didn't make it because he was alone, because no one stood up for him. Because in this world, a cook is a nobody. Dan wasn't a nobody. Not anymore. 12 soldiers stood behind him. The medic had learned to chop onions from him. The warrior mage came for fish. The observer from headquarters hadn't written a report. The captain said, "Get ready." This was more than what the one who carved the letters on the wall had. More, but was it enough? He didn't know. 3 weeks would tell. On the 17th day, she emerged from the forest. Dan was standing at the edge of the woods, gathering wild garlic, when he heard a twig snap. Not an animal. Human. Cautious. He stood up straight. A girl stepped out from behind the trees, tanned to a bronze. A scar across her left eyebrow. White. Old. Dark hair. Short. Cut with a knife. Clothes made of leather and coarse fabric. A carcass on her shoulder. A deer. A mountain deer. Heavy. 40 pounds. She carried it with one hand. In the other, a short bow. A quiver on her back. 2 knives on her belt. She looked at Dan. He looked at her. She asked if this was the 17th's camp. He nodded. She dropped the carcass on the ground, said that Greer owed her 3 hides from last fall, and that she'd brought the meat to settle the debt. She turned away. Dan said, "Wait." She stopped, didn't turn around. He asked her name. Maeve Tall. Hunter. Dark forest. Daughter of a tracker. Dan asked if she knew the forest. Maeve snorted, like a city slicker asking a fish if it knows water. Dan asked if she could bring meat. Regularly. Not to settle a debt. For pay. Maeve turned around. Looked at him. Eyes gray. Hard. Asked what he'd pay her with. Dan said food. Maeve laughed. A short, barking laugh. She said she had enough of her own catch, that she wasn't a beggar. Dan replied that he wasn't offering a catch. He was offering food. Maven didn't understand the difference. She left. Dan butchered the deer, slowly, with respect for the carcass. Meat separate, bones separate, fat separate, liver separate, the tongue separately, the hide set aside. Broth from the bones, clarified butter from the fat, pâté from the liver. He salted the tongue. He divided the meat into 3 parts, one for today, the second for salting, the third he hung in the pantry. The cold air of the pass worked like a refrigerator. The meat would last 4 days. With today's portion, he did something he'd never done before. A steak. A real one. A thick cut from the thigh. He patted it dry with a towel, rubbed it with salt. Coarse salt. Mountain salt. Let it sit for 20 minutes. He heated the skillet until the oil started to smoke. He put the meat in. The sound. That very sound. Sizzling. Crackling. The smell of caramelization. He timed it. 3 minutes on one side. He flipped it. 3 minutes on the other. He took it off, placed it on a cutting board, covered it, let it rest for 5 minutes. Sliced it. Pink inside. Clear juices. Perfect. On Arelon, meat was eaten either raw or boiled until gray. No one seared it over high heat. No one knew that meat needed to rest. No one sliced across the grain so that every bite would melt in your mouth. He set aside one steak, a small one, with the wild berries that Turney had picked that morning on the southern slope. Those very ones. Similar to black currants, sweet and sour, with a tart aftertaste. Dan crushed a handful, mixed it with a drop of honey and a pinch of salt, drizzled it over the meat. It made a sauce. Simple, wild, berry-flavored, like the forest on a plate. Maven came in the evening, for the hide. Greer had repaid his debt, and she was taking what was hers. Dan intercepted her at the entrance. He silently held out the bowl. Maven looked. A steak. Her deer. Her prey. But not the way she usually ate. Not a chunk of meat on a stick by the fire. Sliced. Pink inside. With berries she'd picked herself along the way and hadn't eaten because why bother? With thick, fragrant sauce on top. She took the bowl, didn't sit down, ate standing up, as always. Like a beast would eat, quickly, alertly, ready to drop it and run. She bit off a piece of meat, chewed it, froze, bit off another, slower, even slower. She didn't understand what was happening. She had eaten venison hundreds of times, roasted it over a fire, boiled it in a pot, smoked it on branches. This was her food, her meat. She knew its taste, but not this taste. This one was deeper, richer. The meat was tender, not tough, not dry, not overcooked. Juice dripped down her fingers. The berries added a tartness that brought out the meat's flavor. The salt drew the flavor from every fiber. Maeve finished eating. She stood there, stared at the empty bowl. Then she looked at Dan. There was something new in her eyes. Not distrust, not gratitude, surprise. Pure, childlike surprise that a familiar thing had turned out to be unfamiliar. She set the bowl down. She was silent. Then she said she would come tomorrow. With meat. Dan nodded. Maven went into the forest, without looking back. But she said tomorrow. And tomorrow, for a person who lives one day at a time in the dark forest, is a long time. She came, the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Each time with prey, a mountain hare, a wild bird with blue plumage whose meat smelled of juniper, fish from a forest lake, wide, silvery, fatty, herbs Dan had never seen before, arris root, long, reddish, smelling like ginger but stronger, bitter when raw, but when stewed, the bitterness faded, leaving a warm, spicy note that warmed him from the inside. Maven brought it, and Dan figured it out. He tasted, he sniffed, he cut, he cooked, he fried, he stewed. Every new ingredient was a mystery, and he solved every mystery in 10 minutes at the stove. Because the laws of cooking are universal. Protein coagulates at a single temperature. Fat carries flavor. Acid tenderizes. Salt draws out water. On Earth or on Erlon, in a restaurant or in a shed, the laws are the same. Maven didn't sit down. She ate standing up, every time. She'd take a bowl and move toward the wall, her back to the corner, her face toward the door, like a beast that doesn't expose its back. Dan didn't ask her to sit down, didn't try to persuade her. He just set the bowl on the table every time, a spoon next to it, a spot on the bench next to it. She ignored it, ate standing up. On the 5th day, she sat down, not on the bench, on the floor, by the wall, but she sat. On the 7th day, on the bench, not at the table, next to the table. On the 9th day, at the table, silently. She ate in silence. She left in silence. But she sat at the table, for the first time in years. Dan said nothing. He washed the bowl. He knew that taming wasn't about words. It was about patience and food. The 22nd day, 3 weeks until Haldrick's expected strike. The camp was changing. Dan could feel it. Not just in the kitchen, in the people. The soldiers walked differently, faster, smoother, their backs straighter, their eyes clearer. 3 weeks of proper food. 3 weeks of protein and fat and warmth and flavor. Their bodies responded. Wounds healed faster. Colds cleared up in days, not weeks. Marching endurance had increased by a third. Greer said that during exercises, First Company had completed the full daily quota for the first time in 6 months. The entire company. No stragglers, no casualties, no sick men. Captain Wren said nothing, but Dan saw how he looked at the kitchen every time he walked past. Not at the cook, at the kitchen, as if it were a weapon he was only just beginning to understand. Son A came every morning, she observed. She jotted things down in a little notebook. Numbers, facts, portions, ingredients, cooking times. She worked methodically, like a scout, like a spy. But every morning she sat down at the table and ate porridge with honey from her little pot, which Dan placed in front of her without a word, which she never once asked for, which just appeared, as if that's how it was supposed to be. On the 20th day, she took a second helping for the first time. Half a spoonful, no more, but a second helping. Dan noticed. He didn't show that he'd noticed, but something clicked quietly inside him. She began to allow herself to want. Aislinn came every evening, silently. She sat down, ate fish with bitter herbs, cursed, said it was disgusting, ate some more. Her face was changing, not as fast as she'd like, but it was changing. The burns on her hands were healing. The vomiting after training had stopped. Her essence was recovering, slowly, but steadily. On the 21st day, she threw a fireball at the training ground for the first time and didn't double over afterward. The magic instructor, Corporal Misen, looked at her strangely. He asked what had changed. Aislinn snapped that nothing had. Misen didn't believe her, but he didn't press the issue. That evening, Aislinn came into the kitchen and said thank you for the first time. Quietly, to herself, staring into the bowl. Dan heard her. He replied that the fish was especially fatty today. Aislinn snorted, but the corner of her mouth twitched upward. Almost a smile. Almost. Day 24. Maven brought back from the forest the thing that changed everything. Dan was standing by the cauldron when she came in. She tossed a bundle onto the table. A rag. Inside was meat. Dark. Almost black. With a bluish tinge. It smelled strange. Not like ordinary meat. Deeper, sharper. with a metallic tang in the air. Maven said one word, Ténèbres. Dan didn't know what it was. Maven explained briefly, a beast from the depths of the dark forest. Big, strong, fast. Hunters rarely take it on. 1 in 5 doesn't return. Ténèbres meat is worth a village. Alchemists buy it for potions. Warriors eat it raw before battle for temporary strength. But raw, it twists your guts and half of it comes right back up. Maven killed it this morning, alone, with an arrow to the eye from 30 paces. She brought back the meat. Not all of it, the best cut, from the thigh, where the grain is denser and the flavor stronger. Dan took the meat, sniffed it, held it up to the light. The fibers are dark, dense. Something glitters between them, like veins of ore and stone. Essence. The meat was saturated with the essence. That's why alchemists bought it. That's why warriors ate it raw. But raw meat with such dense fibers is a blow to the stomach. Of course they threw up. Of course half of them couldn't digest it. Preparation is needed. A marinade, acid to soften the fibers, heat to let the protein open up and release what's hidden inside. Time. Dan worked for 3 hours. He sliced the meat thinly, against the grain, soaked it in sour brine from the fermentation pots. An hour. Took it out, dried it off, seared it over high heat. 30 seconds on each side, no more. Then into the pot, with the broth, with orris root, with bitter herbs, with a drop of honey. Simmered over low heat for 2 hours. The meat became tender. The dark color turned to a deep burgundy. The veins of essence dissolved into the broth and it glowed. Not brightly, dimly, like a dying ember, but it glowed. Dan tasted it. It burned his tongue. Not from the heat, from the taste. The taste was like a blow. Deep, powerful, meaty to the extreme. Slightly sweet from the arris, bitter from the herbs, and something else. Something he had never felt before. As if his body were humming from within. As if every muscle had awakened. He looked at his hands. They weren't trembling. For the first time in a week. Sleep deprivation and fatigue had weighed on him every day. His hands would shake by evening. Now they were steady, firm, like after 10 hours of sleep. Ténèbres meat, cooked properly, released the essence into his body. Not through force, not through vomiting, through taste, through a broth that his body accepted as its own. He took a portion to Aislinn. She was sitting by the tent, angry. Training had gone badly. The new spell wouldn't come. She had overused the essence again and felt sick. Dan set down the bowl, told her to try it. Aislinn looked at the broth, at the dim glow. Her eyes widened. She asked what it was. Dan said Ténèbres. Aislinn grabbed the bowl with both hands. She drank it in one gulp. Like water, like medicine. She closed her eyes, froze. A minute later she opened them. She looked at her hands, then at Dan. She said quietly that the essence had returned. Not all of it, but it had returned. In a minute, from a single bowl. She sat and stared at the empty bowl, then at Dan. And for the first time ever, she didn't snap at him, didn't snort. She didn't say she hated him. She just said he needed protection. That if anyone found out he could do that with Ténèbres meat, they'd kill him, or take him away. Dan nodded. He knew. The 26th day, rumors spread quickly. Not from the regiment, from the 9th Regiment stationed a mile to the south. Their messenger, who had come to ask what was burning, told his men. They told the wagoners. The wagoners carried the news to the next garrison. Within a week, everyone along the northern front line knew that in the 17th Regiment there was a cook who kept the soldiers from getting sick. 3 days later, they knew that this cook somehow turned the Ténèbres meat, the stuff that made veterans vomit, into a broth that restored the essence to the mages. Dan didn't know who was talking. He suspected everyone and no one. Information flowed like water. There are no secrets in the army. There is only delay. The quartermasters were the first to arrive, 2 of them, from the headquarters of the northern group, on horseback, with papers. An order to transfer the regimental cook, Khan, to the staff kitchen for the needs of the senior command. Signature, seal. Dan read the paper. His hands didn't tremble. He turned to the messengers and said he wouldn't go. The quartermasters exchanged glances. One pulled out a second paper. An order. Not an instruction. An order. Captain Wren stood nearby. He read over his shoulder. His face was stony. He could not disobey a headquarters order. But he also did not want to hand over the cook who, in a month, had transformed his regiment from doomed cannon fodder into a combat unit. Ren said that Cook Khan was busy preparing the regiment for the upcoming defense of the pass, that transferring him to headquarters would create a critical gap in supplies, that he would send a report personally to General Tolan with his reasoning. The quartermasters looked at Ren, at his 9th level, at his left arm which wouldn't bend, at his calm eyes behind which lay 30 years of war. They left. They left the papers behind. Ren tore them up, silently. He threw the scraps into the mud. He looked at Dan. He said that next time, it wouldn't be the quartermasters who came. Dan nodded. He knew. The 28th day. Maven brought news from the hunt. Strangers in the forest, 3 of them, not hunters, moving quietly, light tracks, professional, heading toward the camp. Maven didn't know who, but she knew they weren't one of us. Dan told Greer. Greer told Ren. Ren reinforced the guards. Dan didn't sleep that night. He sat by the cold hearth and listened to the silence. The pass was silent. The wind, the creaking of tents, a distant howl from the forest. Nothing unusual, but something hung in the air, heavy, like before a storm. At dawn, Son-A came to the kitchen earlier than usual, not for porridge, with information. She said that a request had come through her channels from headquarters, not from the northern faction, from the capital. Someone at court had heard about the cook. Someone wanted to see for themselves. They were sending an inspection, not an observer like her, an inspector, with the authority to take any specialist for the crown's needs. Son-A spoke evenly, without emotion, but her eyes told a different story. She said the inspector would arrive in 10 days, that Dan had 10 days to become indispensable, not to the regiment already knew, to headquarters, to the generals, for the paperwork. They needed numbers. They needed proof. They need a result that can't be chalked up to the weather or luck. Dan asked why she was telling him this. She's an observer. She was sent to spy. Son-A paused. Then she said she was an observer, and she was observing, and what she observes is worth staying here for. Dan looked at her composed face, at her dark eyes in which there was something resembling a decision. She had chosen a side. Quietly, without fanfare, she simply chose. He nodded. 10 days. Dan worked harder than ever, every day from 3 in the morning until midnight. Turney by his side. Ha-Yun when he wasn't in the infirmary. Maven brought game daily. Dan kept track. Every serving, every ingredient, every soldier. Sona gave him paper and he wrote it down. Not recipes. Results. First company. 23 days on a high-calorie diet. Marching endurance up 40%. 0 sick. 0 stragglers on the march. Recovery after training combat 12 hours instead of 48. Company number 3. 18 days on a high-calorie diet. Results are similar. Mag Aislinn Ver. Personal nutrition according to an individual program. Essence recovery 70% faster than normal. Side effects of overuse have disappeared. Wounded in the infirmary. Recovery time cut in half with personalized nutrition. Numbers. Dry. Precise. Indisputable. On the 30th day, Dan did what he had previously avoided. He cooked for Hollis. Not on request, by calculation. Hollis was an enemy, a quiet one. After satisfying, dangerous, he was waiting for an excuse, patiently. Every day he walked past the kitchen and watched. He counted the violations. He kept track. Dan could have fought him, could have bypassed him through Rena, but this is war. In 2 weeks, 5,000 will arrive at the pass. And Hollis, with his 5th level and his sword, will be standing in the front row. A dead Hollis won't help anyone. A living, strong Hollis will hold the flank. Dan didn't ask, didn't explain, he didn't apologize. In the morning, he set a bowl by Hollis's tent, covered, hot, tenebra meat, thinly sliced, seared, in a sauce of bitter herbs and arris root, with a flatbread, with a handful of fermented vegetables. A meal for a 5th-level warrior with an unyielding knee and pain in his right shoulder, which Dan had learned about from Ha-Yun. The arris root warmed his joints from within. The bitter herbs reduced the inflammation. The tenebra fat nourished his muscles. It wasn't just food. It was a meal for Hollis. Personal. Precise. Like a shot. Hollis found the bowl in the morning, had the lid, sniffed, looked around. No one. He could have thrown it away. Could have given it to the orderly. Could have smashed the bowl on a rock. He sat down, took a spoon, ate, slowly, silently, finished, set the bowl by the tent, stood up. He checked his right shoulder, raised his arm, rotated it, winced. Then he didn't wince. He raised it again, more freely, more easily. The pain receded. It didn't go away, it receded. He stood with his arm raised and looked at the bowl. His face didn't change, but he didn't smash the bowl. And in the evening, he set the empty one by the kitchen door, silently. Dan washed it and put it on the shelf. Not a victory, a truce. That's enough for now. Day 35. The inspector from the capital didn't come. Instead, a letter arrived. Sun-Ah brought it to Dan, sealed, with a coat of arms. The letter was addressed to Captain Ren, but Sun-Ah read it first. Scout's skills. Headquarters was calling off the inspection. Temporarily. The situation at the front had changed. Haldrick's vanguard was moving faster than expected. Not 4 weeks. 2, maybe a week and a half. 5,000 soldiers would be at the pass in 10 days. All resources to defense. All checks postponed. All inspections canceled. War doesn't wait for paperwork. Dan listened. 10 days. Not 3 weeks. 10 days. That changed everything. He turned to Ren, who was standing nearby with the letter in his hand. Ren was looking at him. He was silent. Then he said, "Get ready, cook. You're coming with me to the council." For the first time in the history of this regiment, a cook was attending a war council. The council was held in Ren's tent. 6 officers, Hollis, 2 company captains, the sergeant from the 1st company, that very one, Misen, the magic instructor, and Dan. He stood at the entrance, not at the table, at the entrance. Ren spoke. 5,000, 10 days, the pass, a bottleneck. We can hold it, but not for long. Reinforcements were promised, but not guaranteed. We need to hold out for at least a day, 3 at most. How long anyone lasts depends on their training. Ren looked at Dan. The cook spoke up. "Tell us what you need." Hollis flinched, but said nothing. Miska was working. Dan spoke up. Short, clear. He needs meat. A lot. Maven can get it, but she needs helpers to transport it. He needs firewood. 3 carts. For a fire that will burn continuously for 3 days. He needs water. Barrels at every position. He needs time. 1 day before the battle. The whole day, the entire kitchen, all hands on deck. He's going to cook for each company separately. Not one dish for everyone. Separately. For the commander, for the unit, for their wounds and fears. Hollis asked why. Dan replied because that's how it works. Hollis asked how the food could be different for different companies if the ingredients were the same. Dan replied that the ingredients were the same, but the people aren't. Hollis fell silent. Ren nodded. He said, "Give the cook what he asks for." 10 days. Dan counted every one. He spent the first day after the council on reconnaissance. Not military, culinary. He went through every company. He watched the people, their faces, their hands, the way they moved, the way they sat, the way they ate. Greer's first company, veterans, average age 30, strong, muscular, enduring. They eat quickly and in large quantities. They need heavy food, meat, fat, carbs, fuel for a long battle. Second company, mixed, half veterans, half recruits. The recruits are thin and nervous. They need something else, not just fuel. Warmth, confidence, something that tells you not to be afraid. Third company, the rifle company, calm, precise. They eat neatly. They need clarity. Light food that doesn't weigh them down, but gives them focus. Fourth company, the penal company, the most desperate, the most broken. Half have criminal pasts. They eat greedily. They look around. They hide bread in their pockets. They need something they've never had. Generosity. A portion where they don't have to hide half for later. He made a plan. 6 dishes, a different one for each company, plus a separate one for the mages, plus a separate one for the wounded. The ingredient list turned out longer than everything in the storeroom. Maven went into the forest for 2 days, alone. Dan didn't want to let her go. She left without asking. She returned on the 3rd day, loaded down, 2 tenebras, a mountain deer, a sack of arris roots, a bundle of herbs, mushrooms, fish smoked over coals right in the forest. She was dirty, tired, a fresh scar on her left shoulder. A tenebre had scratched it with its claw. Not deep, but it had scratched it. Dan looked at the wound, looked at Maven. She looked away, said that was enough, that this was the last time before the fight, that she needed 2 days to rest. Dan nodded. He led her to the kitchen, washed the wound, bandaged it with a clean bandage from Ha-Yun, sat her down at the table, set a bowl of broth in front of her, hot, that very golden kind, made with bones, with herbs. Maven drank in silence. She held the bowl with both hands, her eyes were closed. Steam rose to her face. She wasn't eating, she was warming herself, from the inside and out. Dan looked at her and thought that this woman had gone into the woods where she could have been killed, so that he could cook dinner before the fight. Not for money, not because he was ordered to. For a bowl of broth and a steak with berries. For the fact that someone was cooking her prey for her for the first time, 5 days before the fight. The kitchen was running non-stop. Turney didn't go to sleep. Dan kept pushing him. Turney came back an hour later. Ha-Yun came in the evenings. She chopped vegetables, silently, precisely. Her surgeon's hands sliced the moon-shaped turnip so evenly that Dan once stopped and just watched. She noticed. She asked what was wrong. He said nothing, just beautiful. Ha-Yun stared at him, then at the turnip. Then she said quietly that in 20 years, no one had ever told her her work was beautiful. Dan replied that cutting cleanly was a talent, whether it's meat or a person. Ha-Yun didn't answer. She went back to the turnip, but she cut it even more evenly. 4 days before the fight. Aislinn didn't come alone. Maizen was with her, a mage instructor, elderly, bearded, 7th level. He stood by the door and looked at Dan with the expression of someone who couldn't believe his eyes. Maizen said that Aislinn had shown him what she was capable of, that her essence was regenerating faster than that of a 3rd-level mage, even though she was only a 2nd level. That he had checked, twice, that it was impossible, that he wanted to know what the cook was giving her. Dan looked at Aislinn. She was standing behind Maizen. Her face looked guilty. She didn't want to tell him, but Maizen had noticed it himself. Dan answered, "Fish, fatty, with bitter herbs." Maizen frowned. He said that wasn't an explanation, that thousands of mages had eaten fish with herbs and felt no effect. Dan shrugged. He said he didn't cook fish with herbs. He cooked for Aislinn. Maizen didn't understand. Dan didn't bother to explain. Maizen left. But he returned in the evening, alone. He sat down at the table. He looked at Dan. He said his back hurt. 20 years, every day. Every evening it gets worse. Potions help for an hour. He asked if the cook could make something. Dan looked at him. An old mage, worn out, his back twisted from years of straining the essence. He nodded. An hour later, Maizen was eating soup with arris root and warm mushrooms. He ate slowly, in silence. When he stood up, he straightened. Not completely, but he straightened. He looked at Dan. He said nothing. But the next day he came again. And Dan realized that his circle was growing. Not because he wanted it to, because people were coming. 3 days before the battle. In the morning, Ren assembled the regiment. Formation, 800 men. Silence. Ren spoke briefly. The enemy is coming. 5,000. In 3 days. The pass is narrow. We hold. Reinforcements are promised. We hold until they arrive. His voice was steady, calm, confident. But the 800 men knew the numbers. 5,000 against 800. 6 to 1. The mathematics of war. The mathematics of death. After the roll call, the camp fell silent. The men prepared. Someone was sharpening a sword. Someone was writing a letter. Someone was praying to gods Dan hadn't yet had time to get to know. Dan stood in the kitchen and counted. Meat, broth, flour, firewood. Enough. Just enough. But enough. 2 days before the battle. Dan began preparing a feast. Not a banquet, not a celebration, a banquet. A separate dish for each company. He had been working since dawn. Turney was nearby. Ha-Yun was nearby. Maven brought the last of the game in the morning and stayed. She didn't help in the kitchen. She stood guard at the door, with a bow, silently. No one entered without Dan's permission. Soon Ah came at noon. She asked how she could help. Dan gave her a knife. She looked at the knife, at the moon turnip, at Dan. Then she silently began to peel. An observer from headquarters, a lieutenant, the regiment's best marksman. She was peeling onions and turnips in the cook's kitchen, because the battle would begin in 2 days, and this was more important than reports. By evening, Aislinn appeared, not to eat, to help. Dan asked her to heat up the cauldrons, with magic. A fireball was too rough. He needed an even, steady heat. Aislinn grumbled for half an hour. She said she was a battle mage, not a stove. Then she concentrated. She placed her hands on the cauldron. The heat flowed evenly, soft, perfect. The cauldron heated up uniformly, not single hot spot. Dan nodded, said she'd make an excellent does. Aislinn nearly set his hair on fire. The night before the battle, Dan hadn't slept. No one had slept. The kitchen was in full swing. 6 cauldrons, 6 dishes, for the first company. A thick meat stew made from tenebra with moon turnips and arris root. Heavy, hot, like armor from the inside. For the second company, meat soup with noodles that Dan had rolled by hand for 3 hours. Soft, enveloping, like a mother's hands. For the new recruits in this company who will go into battle for the first time tomorrow. For the third company of riflemen, fish with mushrooms and herbs, light, clear, so the eye is sharp and the hand is steady. For the fourth penal company, huge portions of meat with bread, more than one can eat, on purpose, so there's leftovers. So these people who've spent their whole lives hiding bread in their pockets can see there's enough food, that there's no need to hide it, that someone gave enough to go around. For the mages, a broth made from tenebra, concentrated, with bitter herbs, essence, and every spoonful. For the wounded in the infirmary, a light broth with honey, so the body doesn't waste energy on digestion but uses it for healing. Dan stood by the cauldrons, stirring, tasting, adding. His hands moved on their own. 30 years of experience, thousands of kitchens, tens of thousands of servings. It all led to this moment. To the night before the battle at the pass in a foreign world, to 6 cauldrons, to 800 bowls. Turney carried firewood, Hayun chopped, Maven stood guard, Sona peeled vegetables, Iceland heated the cauldrons. 5 people, his kitchen, his family. He didn't know when they had become a family, but they had. Somewhere between the first bowl of broth and this night, somewhere between the sergeant's tears and Maven's silence at the table, they had become one. At dawn, Dan carried out the cauldrons. 6 cauldrons, 6 locations. Each company position had its own. The soldiers approached, silently. They took their bowls, sat down, ate. The first company ate tenebra stew. Men with beards and scars chewed the meat and stared into space. There was no despair in their eyes. Calm. The heavy, dark calm of people who know they are going to their deaths and have accepted it. The second company ate noodle soup. The recruits slurped with trembling hands. One 17-year-old boy ate and cried. Silently. The soup reminded him of home, his mother, the kitchen he had left 3 months ago. He cried and ate. The fourth company, the disciplinary unit, stared at their rations. At the meat, of which there was more than enough. At the bread, of which there was just enough. One burly man with a tattoo on his neck took a piece of bread. He looked at it, put it back in the bowl, didn't hide it in his pocket. For the first time, he ate slowly, without looking around. Dan saw it from behind the cauldrons, and it was worth 4 sleepless nights. They came at dawn, dust on the horizon, then the banners, black with silver, Haldrick, the vanguard. The front ranks appeared on the northern slope before the sun had risen over the ridge. Dan stood by the kitchen and watched, far away, but visible. Thousands of them. They moved like a river, slowly, unstoppable, flooding the valley before the pass. The regiment's bugle blared, a long, heavy sound. Form up! 800 men took their positions. Dan didn't go out. His place was here, by the cauldrons, by the fire. In the rear, which wasn't a rear but a foothold. The first blow fell on the right flank. The second company was stationed there. A mixed unit, veterans and recruits. Dan would remember the sound of the clash for the rest of his life. Not the clang of swords. A rumble. A heavy, wet rumble of bodies and shields and iron. Screams. Then the screams grew quieter, not because they had died down, because they had become familiar. War sounds the same in the first minute, in the 10th hour. The ear simply stops distinguishing. Dan started a fire, put water on to boil, sliced the meat. He started cooking. The first wounded would arrive in an hour, maybe sooner. He had to be ready. The first wounded man arrived 40 minutes later, a boy from the second company. His arm was hanging limply, dislocated or broken. His face was pale. His eyes were glassy. Shock. 2 men brought him in. They laid him down by the infirmary. Ha-Yun was already there, working. Her hands were covered in blood. Her face was stony. A professional. Dan brought the broth, hot. That very golden broth. He set it down by the entrance. Ha-Yun nodded without looking up. They poured the broth into the wounded man's mouth, spoonful by spoonful. He swallowed, mechanically, but he swallowed. The warmth went inside. The color of his face turned slightly pink. The shock receded a half step. That was enough for Ha-Yun to set his shoulder. The guy screamed, then fell silent. Then he asked for more broth. By noon, there were 30 wounded. By evening, 60. Dan didn't count the dead. He couldn't. He didn't want to. He cooked, non-stop. Broth for the wounded, soup for those returning from the front lines for a short rest, flatbreads you could eat with one hand, meat cut into strips you could chew on the go. He'd adapted the kitchen for battle, not a restaurant, a field hospital plus a gas station. Soldiers came in, dirty, covered in blood, their own and others. They sat down, ate, 5 minutes, got up, went back, to the front lines, to death, to life. Dan fed them, everyone, quickly, hot, with meat, with warmth. Aislinn was fighting. Dan didn't see it, but he heard it. Explosions of fireballs on the right flank, crackling, flashes. She was burning essence, quickly. By noon she returned to the kitchen, barely standing, her face gray, her hands were shaking, her eyes were empty. Dan sat her down. He gave her a bowl, broth from the tenebra, bitter, fatty, concentrated. She drank. Her teeth chattered against the rim of the bowl. 10 minutes later, the color returned. Her hands stopped shaking. Her eyes lit up. She stood up, looked at Dan, nodded, went back to her position. An hour later, Dan heard new explosions on the right flank. She was back. He knew she would return. Night. The fighting didn't stop. Haldrick pressed forward, in waves. One retreats, another advances, without pause. Exhaustion, wearing down the defenders with fatigue. The pass is narrow. They can't deploy more than 300 head-on, but 3,000 are waiting in reserve, fresh, rested, well-fed. And Wren had 800, now 700. No, 650. Killed, seriously wounded, those who would never rise again. Dan counted by the bowls. In the morning he handed out 800 portions. In the evening, 670. The difference is the dead and the dying. He stood by the cauldron and stirred the soup. His hands moved, his head counted. Another day at this rate and the regiment will lose half its men. 2 more days and there will be no one left to hold the line. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Hollis. Dan didn't recognize him at first. His face was covered in blood. His left eye was swollen shut. His armor was dented, a sword in his hand. He hadn't sheathed the sword. He'd simply come in with it. He sat down on a bench, heavy, slow, like an old man. He's 32. Today he looked 60. Dan set a bowl in front of him. Meat, hot, with bread. Hollis ate in silence, chewed, swallowed, mechanically. Then he stopped, looked at Dan, for a long time. Said that the 3rd Company had lost its commander, an arrow in the throat. That the 1st Company was holding the center, but the flanks were weakening. That the mages were at their limit. That they'd hold out until morning. Maybe, if they were lucky. Then he fell silent. Until he ate. He stood up, stopped at the door. Without turning around, he said, "Cook, that soup for the riflemen. The one from this morning." Captain Wayne said that after eating it, he could see the target as clearly as in daylight. In the dark. Hollis paused. Then he said, "Cook some more for the night shift." He left. Dan stood there and looked at the door. Hollis had asked, not ordered, asked. For the first time. Dan cooked all night. Soup for the shooters, fish with mushrooms and bitter herbs. Light. Clear. The mushrooms sharpened the senses. The herbs cleared the head. The fish oil nourished the eyes. It's not magic. It's biochemistry. In his world, nutritionists knew this. Omega-3s for the brain, antioxidants for vision, bitterness for concentration. Here it worked more powerfully, because the local produce was more potent than Earth's. Mushrooms from the dark forest, fish from the mountain lakes, herbs from the pass. Everything more concentrated, everything brighter. As if the nature of Erlon knew that people would fight and had stockpiled for them the very best of its forests and mountains. At 3 in the morning, he carried the cauldron to the rifleman's position. Alone, through the mud, through the darkness, past the wounded, past the dead who hadn't yet been removed, past the soldiers sleeping right on the ground, 10 paces from the enemy line. He made it. He set the pot down. The rifleman ate in silence, in the dark. One said that after this soup he could see like an owl. Another said nothing. He just finished eating and went back to his position. 20 minutes later, shouts were heard from the enemy side. Haldrick's night raid. 50 men in the dark. The riflemen of the 3rd Company, without a commander and half their strength, took out all 50 in 6 minutes, in the dark, by ear and by sight. Dan carried the empty pot back and heard the rifleman counting the bodies. 50 out of 50. Dawn of the second day. Dan stood by the pot and couldn't feel his hands. 2 days without sleep. The previous Khan's body was weak. His body was weak. He was holding on to something, to habit. An 18-hour shift at the restaurant, 36 hours on his feet before the Michelin inspection. He knew how to stay awake, knew how to work when his body told him to stop. Turney was nearby. The boy hadn't slept either. His face was gray, his eyes were red, but his hands worked. Cutting, carrying, washing, no complaints. Ha-Yun hadn't come by since last night. The infirmary was hell. 80 wounded. She's alone. Dan sent Turney with broth for her personally. Not for the wounded, for her. A small pot, with honey, with warmth. Turney returned, said Ha-Yun drank it standing up, with one hand. With the other, she was stitching a wound. She didn't stop. Dan nodded. She won't stop until she falls, so we have to feed her so she doesn't fall. Noon on the second day. Haldrick changed tactics. No waves. One powerful strike. Right at the center. The entire force. 1,500 at once. The sound was so loud that Dan fell. Not from the impact, from the sound. The ground shook. The cauldron shifted. Water splashed out. He got up, set the cauldron back in place. His hands were shaking. Not from fatigue, from fear. He was afraid, for the first time ever. Not for himself, for them. For Turney, who stood nearby holding a ladle like a sword. For Ha-Yun, who was stitching people up in the infirmary. For Aislinn, who was burning herself on the right flank. For Maven, who was standing on the roof of the barn with a bow, shooting at those breaking through the lines. For Sunna, who was somewhere in the center, shooting. She's the regiment's best marksman. Right now she's on the front line. With a rifle. No, with a bow. There are bows here. She was shooting. He heard it. The center buckled. It didn't break, it buckled. Greer's first company took the brunt of the attack. They retreated 10 paces, 20, 30. Then they stood their ground. They stood and didn't budge. Greer was in the front row, shield in his left, axe in his right. The 9th hour of battle for him personally. He stood, because that morning he'd eaten tenebrae stew, because his body had been properly fed for the first time in 3 years of war, because behind him he could smell smoke from the kitchen, and he knew that if he held out, there'd be soup that evening. This isn't poetry, it's physiology. A man who remembers the taste of home fights longer than one who has forgotten. The first company held the center until evening, lost a third of its men, but held. Evening of the second day. Haldrick withdrew the troops. Not for long, just for the night. Regrouping. They'd finish them off in the morning. They knew it. Everyone knew it. Wren inspected the positions. He returned to the kitchen. He sat down. For the first time, Dan saw the captain sitting in his kitchen. Wren said the regiment had lost 200 men. 600 remained. Tomorrow morning, 1,000 fresh troops from Haldrick would arrive. Reinforcements from Velenmar were promised by evening on the third day. We had to hold out for another day. Wren fell silent. He ate his soup, slowly. Then he looked at Dan. He said one word. Stay. Dan replied, I've already stayed. The night before the third day, 600 men, half are wounded. A quarter can handle their weapons properly. The rest are holding on out of stubbornness and fear. Haldrick has lost a lot. The pass is narrow. There are so many corpses in front of the positions that they're blocking the way. But Haldrick has reserves, a fresh 1,000. And the 17th Regiment has nothing, except the kitchen. Dan left the shed at 2 in the morning. He walked through the camp, quiet. Past the tents, past the wounded lying on the ground because there's no room in the infirmary, past the campfires where soldiers sat staring into the flames. He walked and looked, at each one, at their faces, at their hands, at the way they sat, hunchbacked, empty, broken. The third day of non-stop fighting, their bodies at their limit. But it wasn't their bodies that worried him, their spirit. They had broken. Not all of them, but most. He could see it. Empty eyes, drooping shoulders, hands lying limply on their knees. They were waiting for morning as if awaiting execution. They didn't believe they would survive. And if a man doesn't believe, he won't hold out. No amount of flesh can replace willpower. Dan returned to the kitchen. He sat down. He closed his eyes. He thought. What could he give to 600 people who had lost hope? Not strength, not the essence, hope. He opened his eyes, he looked at the wall, at the inscription. Sorry I didn't make it in time to feed you. Whoever wrote this knew that food isn't fuel. Food is a voice that says, you're not alone. Someone got up at 3 in the morning and cooked for you. Someone was thinking of you. Someone knows you're alive. Dan stood up. He walked over to the pantry. He opened it. Meat for 2 days. Flour for 1 day. Honey at the bottom of the jar. The last mushrooms. The last iris root. He could stretch it out. Give out a little at a time. Over 3 meals. Morning, lunch, dinner. Or he could give it all away. Right now. Everything he had. Every scrap. Every drop. 1 meal. 1 night. 1 last gamble. He chose the second option. He started at 3 in the morning. He stoked all the fires. He set all the pots on the heat. 6 of them. All the meat in the broth. All the bones. All the fat. All the mushrooms. All the orris root. All the flour for noodles. He rolled the noodles by hand, quickly, precisely. The dough was obedient. Flour and water and salt. The simplest things. But his hands knew what to do with the simplest things. The noodles even. Long, thin. He hung them on sticks over the cauldrons to dry. Every last drop of honey went into the broth for the wounded. Maven woke up from the smell. She came into the kitchen. She looked. She didn't ask. She started carrying water. Turney was chopping wood. Dan didn't wake him. Turney woke up on his own. He heard the clang of a knife. Ha-Yun came from the infirmary. Her hands were covered in blood. Her eyes were dry, empty. 4 had died during the night. She stood in the doorway and watched Dan roll out the noodles. Then she walked over. She took the knife. She began cutting the meat, silently, beside them. Aishlin came last. She stood by the cauldrons. She placed her hands on them. The heat flowed evenly, gently, without words. Sona didn't come. She was on duty, night watch. But she'd be here in the morning. Dan knew. He was cooking soup. 1 soup, for everyone. Not 6 courses for 6 mouths. 1 soup for 600 people. Meat soup, with handmade noodles, with mushrooms, with orris root, with the last pinch of salt from the sack, with the last drop of oil, with everything he had. He put it all in, every last bit. No reserves for tomorrow, because if they didn't hold out today, there would be no tomorrow. The soup was simmering. A thick aroma rose above the shed. It spread through the camp, through the tents, to the positions, over the ground where the wounded lay. The smell of meat, the smell of noodles, the smell of home, the smell of life. Dawn. Dan carried out the cauldrons. He placed them in the center of the camp, not at the company positions, in the center. 1 large table, 1 line, everyone in a single line. Soldiers emerged from the tents, from under the shelters, from the trenches. They walked toward the pots, slowly, silently, like sleepwalkers. They took bowls. Dan served them, each one personally, ladle by ladle. He looked each one in the face, to each one, without looking away, without hurrying. Everyone got a look. Everyone got a bowl. Everyone got a moment when the cook looked at them and saw them. Not a soldier, not a number, a person. They ate, some sitting, some standing, some lying down because they couldn't stand. Turney carried bowls to the wounded. Ha-Yun fed those who couldn't eat on their own, spoonful by spoonful, to the one lying down, to the one dying, to the one who could no longer see but still swallowed. The soup was hot, thick, meaty. The noodles were soft, long, slippery. The broth was golden with a dark sheen from the mushrooms. Eris warmed them from the inside. The mushrooms gave them strength. The meat gave body. But that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was the taste, a taste that spoke. I didn't give up. I stood here all night and cooked for you. If I didn't give up, then don't you give up either. You're not alone. Here's a bowl. Here's a spoon. Here's warmth. Live. The sergeant ate. That same one, the red-faced one, from day 1. He sat in the mud. His armor was crumpled. A fresh scar ran from his temple to his chin. He ate the soup, and tears streamed down his cheeks. Again, just like on the first day, a month ago, a lifetime ago. He ate and cried and didn't wipe them away. His men sat nearby. They were eating too. They were silent too, but their shoulders weren't slumped anymore. Their backs were straight, not because of the meat, not because of the heiress, because someone had stayed awake all night for them. It's a simple thought, an ancient one, older than any magic. Someone was thinking of me. That means I exist. That means it's worth trying for one more day. Haldrick sounded the charge at 9 in the morning. A fresh 1,000 men, full formation, banners, drums, beautiful, terrifying. They marched toward the pass as if on parade, confident, calm, against 600 half-dead defenders who had one battle left in them. The first company took the center, Greer in front, shield, axe. 9 hours on their feet for those who hadn't slept, but they stood and didn't waver, because in their bellies burned the meat and arrows and noodles that the cook had rolled out by hand at 3 o'clock, but chi. Archers fired from the flanks, steady, precise. Every arrow hit its mark. Mages held the barrier on the left flank. Aislinn stood at the front. Fireballs flew one after another. She burned essence and burned essence and burned, but she didn't fall, because she drunk Tenebra broth that morning and her body remembered. Hollis led the counterattack on the right flank, sword in his right hand, shield in his left. The shoulder that had ached for 20 years worked flawlessly. He slashed and slashed, but the pass wouldn't yield. Haldrick pressed on. 1 hour, 2, 3, 5, 6 hours of continuous battle. The 17th Regiment was losing men, 10, 20, 30, but it didn't break. It didn't run. It didn't give up its position. It stood its ground. 600 became 500. 500 became 450. Dan was boiling, non-stop. The last supplies, water and salt, bones that had already given everything and were giving more. He boiled water from the bones, and even that water was hot. It was something. It was a voice. Turney carried bowls to the positions, under fire, under arrows. A 17-year-old boy ran with bowls of hot soup among the dying and never once fell. Once an arrow passed through the palm of his hand, just inches from his head. He didn't notice. Noon. Greer fell. The shield cracked, the axe from his hand, an arrow in his thigh. He fell to one knee. The enemy swung his sword. A soldier from the first company shielded Greer with his shield, dragged him away. They carried Greer to the infirmary. Hayun stitched him up. Dan brought broth. Greer was conscious. He drank, through clenched teeth. It hurts, but he drank. He looked at Dan. He said, "Cook, you're a fool. We should have run," Dan replied. "Nowhere to run. My cauldrons are here." Greer laughed. He coughed. He laughed again. 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The defensive line was cracking. Hollis was wounded. Not seriously. His arm, but his left. The one with the shield. Without the shield, he's vulnerable. Meissen was at her limit. The magical barrier flickered and faltered. Aislinn held the line, alone. The entire left flank. She stood there, burning and burning, her face as white as paper, her eyes glowing not green but yellow from overusing essence. Dan could see her from the kitchen. He saw her staggering between blows. He saw her fall to one knee. "Get up! Strike! Fall! Get up!" He grabbed the last bowl of broth from the shadows, ran, through the mud, through the bodies, to her. Aislinn was on her knees. Her hands were hanging down, empty. The essence was gone. He fell beside her, held out the bowl. "Drink." She looked at him. Her eyes were cloudy. She couldn't see. He tilted the bowl. The broth flowed into her mouth. She swallowed, automatically. 1 sip, 2, 3. Her eyes cleared. Her hands lit up. She stood up, raised her hand. A fireball struck Haldrick's ranks, the most powerful of the entire battle. A row of enemies fell. She turned to Dan. He was kneeling in the mud with an empty bowl. She said one word. "More." He replied that there wasn't any, that this was the last of it. She nodded, turned back to the enemy, and held the left flank for another 2 hours on a single sip of broth and sheer stubbornness. 5 o'clock in the evening. A horn. Not the regimental one, a distant one, from the south. Everyone froze. Haldrick froze. Dan froze by the cauldron, an empty ladle in his hand. The horn sounded again, long, low. Velenmar's battle cry. Reinforcements. General Tullin's 2,000-strong corps struck Haldrick's rear from the southern pass. Fresh, well-fed, angry. Haldrick wavered. He retreated. He ran. Not immediately, an hour later, but he ran, for the first time. Commander Waylock led the troops back. For the first time in the entire war, the Cane Doll Pass held. Evening. Silence. A strange, deafening silence after a day of continuous thunder. Soldiers sat on the ground, stood, lay down, couldn't believe it. It was raining, light, cold. Dan stood under a canopy of ponchos, by the cauldron, empty. It was all over. Meat, flour, salt, firewood, everything. He looked at the rain, at the mud, at the people sitting in that mud, silent. At Turney, who was sleeping right on the ground by the kitchen entrance. At Maeve, who was sitting on the roof of the barn with an onion on her lap, staring into the forest. At Iceland, who was lying by the extinguished fire, motionless. At Ha-Yun, who was still sewing, still. The light was on in the infirmary. She hadn't stopped. Dan looked at it all, at the rain, at the blood, at the silence, and he felt that this was the right place, that he was here because he was meant to be here, that whoever had carved the inscription on the wall wanted exactly this. Not victory, not glory, for someone to stand by the cauldron while everything around him was tearing apart, and just cook, because that was the only thing he knew how to do, and because that was enough. Wren approached him, the regiment captain, 9th level, 30 years of war. He stood in the rain, wet, covered in blood, his left arm stiff, his right bandaged as well. He looked at Dan for a long time. Then he said, "Stay." Dan smiled, for the first time in 3 days. "I already stayed. You already said so." Wren nodded. He was silent. Then he said, "Then cook. Make me some tea." Dan laughed. He put the water on, found the last handful of dried herbs, brewed it, served it. Wren drank while standing in the rain, in silence. Dan stood nearby, in silence. The rain fell. The pass was silent. The war continued. But today, right now, it was quiet, and there was tea. It had rained for 3 days after the battle. Dan sat in the empty kitchen and listened to the water pounding on the shed's roof. There were no supplies, none at all. He'd used the last handful of salt to make tea for Wren. The pot stood empty. The fire had gone cold. Turney had been sleeping for 2 days straight. Maven had gone into the woods for game but hadn't returned yet. The regiment was receiving rations from the supply train. Gray bread, salted meat. The very same porridge that Dan had poured out of the pot on the first day. The circle had closed. 450 men were eating the same thing they had eaten before him, and the difference was deafening. The soldiers chewed the gray bread and stared at the kitchen, at the closed barn door, at the dying smoke. They waited. Dan couldn't give them anything. For the first time since he'd woken up in this world, he was useless. On the 4th day, a supply train arrived. Not the regiment's, a transfer one. 2 wagons escorted by a dozen cavalrymen, soldiers in uniformed cloaks, from the capital. The carts stopped by the command tent. Wren came out. A security officer handed him a paper. Wren read it. His face didn't change. Then he rolled it up. He looked at Dan, who was standing by the barn. He beckoned him over. The carts were for the kitchen. Flour, oil, salt, grains, honey, spices, real spices in sealed pouches, pepper, cinnamon, something local with a pungent smell that Dan didn't recognize, and meat, fresh, wrapped in canvas cloths soaked in something cool, alchemical cooling. The meat was like it had come straight from the refrigerator. Dan stood and looked at the carts, at the sacks, at the barrels, at the meat. It was more than he had received in the entire month at the pass. The note bore the seal of the Northern Group headquarters and a single line. For the regimental kitchen of the 17th Regiment, by personal order. No signature. Someone up top had noticed that the regiment had held out. Someone had decided that the cook they'd wanted to take away was worth feeding his kitchen. Politics. Calculation. Dan didn't care. He had food again. He cooked all day, alone. Turney hadn't gotten up yet. Ha-Yun was in the infirmary. Maven was in the woods. He cooked, and it felt like coming home. A knife in his hand, a cutting board within reach, the smell of onions in the pan, the sizzling of oil, steam rising from the pot. His body ached. His hands were calloused. His back wouldn't straighten. But he cooked, because it was the only thing he knew how to do, and because 450 men were waiting outside the barn wall. Not for orders, not for reinforcements, for dinner. That evening the regiment ate, real food for the first time in 4 days, meat stew with new spices, bread with fresh butter, broth with arris root that Maven had saved before the battle. The soldiers ate in silence, not out of surprise, out of relief. That taste had returned, the one that told you someone had stood over the cauldron thinking of you. The sergeant, that very one, walked past kitchen. He stopped. He looked at Dan. He nodded. He left. It was more than words. On the 5th day after the battle, a man arrived at the camp whom Dan had both been waiting for and feared. A cavalry unit, 20 horsemen. At the front, an officer in black armor, black and silver, Haldrick, a white flag on a spear, a truce. Wren went out to meet him. The officer dismounted. He took off his helmet. Young, just over 30, a stern face, gray eyes, cold, calm, like a man who measures the world in numbers. Commander Waylock Haldrick, the Emperor's nephew, commander of the Northern Army, the very one who led 5,000 men to the pass and retreated for the first time in his life. Waylock requested a meeting, not with Wren, with the cook. Wren refused. Waylock insisted. He said he hadn't come to fight, he'd come to talk. A white flag, a truce. Wren looked at him for a long time. Then he turned to Dan. Dan nodded. Let him in. Waylock sat in the kitchen, on a bench, hands on the table, unarmed. His men stayed outside. He looked at the shed, at the cauldrons, at the pots by the wall, at the clean floor, at the knives lined up in a row, at the bundles of herbs hanging from the ceiling, then at Dan. He said he'd heard, what he knew, that his intelligence had been watching the regiment for 2 months, that he knew about the broth that restores the essence to mages, about the soup that lets archers shoot in the dark, about the stew that makes veterans fight twice as long as normal. He said this wasn't cooking, it was a weapon, and the weapon should belong to whoever has the most hands. He has 20,000. Dan listened. Waylock spoke calmly. No threats, no pressure. Facts, numbers, logic. Come with me. You'll save more lives. 20,000 instead of 400. Math. Simple. Dan set a bowl in front of him. Soup. Meat soup. With noodles. The same one. Waylock looked at the bowl. At Dan. He picked up a spoon. He ate slowly, neatly, expressionless. When he finished, he set the bowl down. He looked at his hands, then at Dan. Something in his eyes changed. For a second. Less than a second. Then it returned. Coldness, calculation, control. But Dan saw it. He saw it for a second. Behind the icy commander sat a boy who was fed on a schedule, not out of love. Waylock stood up. He repeated his offer. Dan replied, I cook for those I know. I don't know your 20,000. Waylock nodded. He paused. Then he said, so tomorrow we're enemies again. Dan replied that they were enemies today too. It's just that the enemies are taking a break for soup. Waylock looked at him. Something twitched at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, the shadow of a smile. He turned and walked away. The next day, Dan learned from Wren that Waylock had led the army 20 miles north. A regrouping. A month's respite. Maybe 2. Dan washed the bowl the commander had eaten from, and thought that soup wouldn't stop the war. But the soup bought a month, and a month is a lot. 2 months after the battle, the camp had changed. New tents, new people. Headquarters had sent reinforcements. 300 recruits, boys, untrained. Just like Turney 3 months ago. The regiment was back up to 800, but 300 of them didn't know war, didn't know the pass, didn't know what it was like to stand in formation for 6 hours while thousands were coming at you. Wren pushed them hard in drills. Hollis pushed them hard in fencing. Myson pushed them hard in magic training. And Dan fed them. Every day. 3 times a day. No days off. No breaks. The kitchen ran like a heart, non-stop. Turney had grown. Not in skill, in height. In 3 months of normal food, the boy had grown 4 centimeters and gained 6 kilograms. Muscles appeared. His face filled out. The wound on his arm healed. A scar remained. Thin, white. He wore it like a medal. In the kitchen, he no longer just carried water. He cooked. Dan taught him from the very first week. How to hold a knife. How to peel vegetables. How to tell if meat was done by touch. How to listen to the pot. Turney learned eagerly, silently. He repeated each step 10 times. His hands were rough. A soldier's hands, but precise. After a month, he could cook porridge that didn't make you cry. After 2, he could make broth that wasn't golden but at least yellow. Dan looked at him and thought that if he were killed, Turney would carry on. Not as well, but he would carry on. The kitchen wouldn't die with him. That was important. Ha-Yun had changed. Not broken, not empty, alive. She still worked in the infirmary. She still stitched up wounds. She still lost people. But now, she had a tool she didn't have before. Broths, decoctions, porridges for the wounded. Dan taught her 7 recipes for different types of wounds. For blood loss, for fever, for inflammation, for fractures, for burns, for exhaustion, for shock. 7 recipes, simple, made from readily available ingredients, not magic, not potions, food. Ha-Yun used them, and the mortality rate in the infirmary dropped by half. Not because the food healed the wounds, because a body that eats properly fights for life more fiercely than a body that starves. A simple idea. 20 years at war, and she learned this from a cook. One night, Ha-Yun came into the kitchen, at 3 o'clock, just like back then, the first time. Dan wasn't asleep. He was making broth for tomorrow. She sat down, silently. She sat there for a long time. Then she said that over the past month, not a single wounded person she'd fed using his recipes had died. Not a single one. For the first time in 20 years, she said it matter-of-factly, without tears, without a tremor in her voice, like a doctor, like a fact. Then she fell silent. Then she quietly added that he had given her a purpose again, that she had been working on autopilot, like a machine, because there was no one else. And now she works because she can save lives, because she has the means to do so. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. When she fell silent, he placed a bowl in front of her. Broth. Hot. For her. Not for the wounded. For her personally. Ha-Yun took it. She drank slowly, with both hands. Just like the first time. 2 masters. Of different crafts. 1 language. They didn't need any more words. Aislinn had changed the most, and was the least willing to admit it. She still yelled, still hurling fireballs, still calling everyone in the kitchen useless. But now she didn't just come for the fish. She came to sit. In the evenings, after training, she'd sit in the corner, silent. Sometimes she'd fall asleep right on the bench. Dan would cover her with her cloak and not wake her. In the morning she'd wake up, complain that her neck hurt, eat breakfast, leave, come back in the evening. The kitchen became her place, not the camp, not the tent, not the training ground. The kitchen, warm, smelling of food, safe, the only place in her entire life where no one demanded anything of her, where she could just sit and not feel the heat. In the 3rd month, something happened that Dan wasn't ready for. Night. The kitchen. He was alone. Cooking. The door opened. A woman entered. Tall. Thin. White hair down to her shoulders. She moved so quietly that Dan didn't hear her footsteps. Just a draft from the door. He turned around. She was standing 3 steps away. Black clothing. Not a single unnecessary detail. A belt. 2 blades on the belt. Short. Curved. Assassin's blades. Light eyes, almost colorless. An expressionless face. Beautiful. Empty. Like a mask. She looked at Dan. He looked at her. 3 seconds of silence. Then he turned back to the cauldron. He didn't run away. He didn't scream. He didn't grab a knife. He turned back to the pot and said, "Sit down. Eat. Then kill me if you still want to." She didn't move. 5 seconds. 10. Dan stirred the soup. With his back to her blades, to her trained hands that had been killing since she was 5. He didn't turn around. He took out a bowl, poured it. Soup with handmade noodles. The very same one. With meat, with herbs, with hot steam rising from it. He set it on the table, a spoon next to it. He stepped back, returned to the pot. She was standing, staring at the bowl, at the soup, at the steam, at the spoon. Then she sat down, not at the table, on the edge of the bench, 1 hand on the bowl, the other on the blade. She ate, quickly, standing, no, half sitting, ready to jump up, ready to strike. But she ate. Hot soup, noodles, meat, broth. She ate like a person who doesn't remember what it's like to sit at a table, like a person who was taught to eat quickly so the poison wouldn't have time to take effect. She finished, set down the bowl, hand on the blade, looked at Dan. For a long time, he stood by the cauldron, with his back to her, stirring, waiting. She stood up, walked over. 2 steps. He could feel her behind him, the smell of steel, the smell of the road, the smell of a person who hadn't washed in 3 days because they'd been walking non-stop. She stood there. He cooked. A minute. 2. Then she placed the blade on the table, hilt toward him. Quietly, she said, "I can't." Her voice was hoarse, low, emotionless, just a fact. Can't. Dan turned around. She was standing there. Her hands were empty. Her eyes were empty. But not dead. For the first time in 26 years, not dead, alive, confused, like a child who's been led out of a dark room into the light and doesn't know where to look. Brenna Hollow, Imperial assassin, sent to kill the cook. She stayed. Dan didn't ask why, didn't ask who sent her, didn't ask what would happen. He set down a second bowl. She sat down, at the table. This time at the table. She ate slowly. She held the spoon awkwardly, like someone who had always eaten with their hands or a knife. Dan sat across from her. He ate his portion, in silence. Two people at the table, a warm kitchen, rain outside the wall, soup in bowls. Everything was simple. Everything was as it should be. Brenna didn't leave. She slept in the kitchen, by the wall, curled up, like an animal. She woke at the slightest sound. For the first 3 days, she didn't speak. She ate whatever was given to her. She watched. At Dan, at Turney, at the people who came into the kitchen, studying, assessing, out of habit. An assassin doesn't stop being an assassin just because they've laid down their blade. On the 4th day, she said they would come for her, that Haldrick doesn't forgive failures, that she had 2 weeks until the checkpoint. If she didn't report that the mission was complete, they'd send someone else. Or 3. Dan nodded. He asked what she was proposing. Brenna looked at him. She said she knew their methods, knew their routes, knew their poisons, and knew their weaknesses. That she could defend the kitchen better than a company of soldiers, if they let her stay. Dan asked why she wanted to do this. Brenna was silent for a long time. Then she said the soup was warm, that in her 31 years of life, no one had ever set a bowl in front of her and said, "Eat." That she'd been taught to eat standing up, quickly, so the poison wouldn't have time to take effect. That she didn't remember the taste of food because food was fuel, not something else. And his soup was something else. She didn't know what, but she wanted to find out. Ren found out about her 2 days later. He came into the kitchen. He saw her. He turned red. An Imperial assassin in the regimental camp. That's a firing squad. For her and for whoever sheltered her. Dan stood between Ren and Brenna. He said she was with him, that she wasn't a threat, that the kitchen needed her. Ren looked at Dan as if he were crazy, then at Brenna. She was standing against the wall, hands down, unarmed. Dan had hidden her blades. Ren said it was impossible, that it was against the regulations, that it was against the law. What if headquarters found out? Dan said headquarters wouldn't find out, that Brenna would be listed as a kitchen assistant, that he'd take responsibility. Ren was silent for a minute. Then he said the cook had gone mad. Then he left. He didn't give the order to arrest her. He didn't report it. He just left. Dan realized that Ren trusted him more than the regulations. It was scary and important at the same time. A week later, Brenna became a shadow in the kitchen. No one saw her move. No one heard her. But she was everywhere. By the door at night, on the roof during the day, behind Dan's back as he walked through the camp. Maven sensed her first. She came into the kitchen. She looked at Brenna. Brenna looked at Maven. 2 predators, one of the forest, one of the city. They stood there for a minute, staring at each other. Then Maven nodded. Brenna nodded. That was enough. Trust between hunters requires no words. It requires a glance. The 4th month. Ren received an order from the capital. Chef Khan is summoned for a private audience with King Velenmar. Not a request, an order. The royal seal. Dan read the paper and felt his throat tighten. The capital, the palace, politics, everything he'd been hiding from behind the cauldrons. He could have refused, could have asked Ren to protect him like last time. But the royal seal isn't a staff order, it's higher than that. Sonne stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. Her face was calm, but her eyes were quick. She was weighing her options. She said quietly that refusal was impossible, that they had to go, that she would go with him, that she knew the court, she knew the rules, she knew who was dangerous and who wasn't. Dan looked at her straight back, at her sharp eyes, at the woman who had come 3 months ago to spy and was now ready to go with him to the capital as an ally. He nodded. The journey took 6 days. Dan rode a horse for the first time in his life. Everything ached. Sonne rode beside him, silently. Brenna rode behind, invisible. She hadn't agreed to stay. She said that if the cook left without protection, the capital would devour him. Not a metaphor, literally. Dan didn't argue. The capital of Velenmar. Kael'mor. Dan saw it from the hill, White walls, towers, flags, beautiful, rich, dead. The city smelled different than the camp, not of sweat and blood, of perfumes and rot. The smell of a court, the smell of power that covers decay with gold. Dan knew that smell. In the restaurant world, there were places like this, beautiful on the outside, dead on the inside. A palace, marble, carpets, servants in livery. He was led into the kitchen, the royal kitchen. Huge, 10 stoves, 20 cooks, copper cauldrons, silverware, and food that smelled of nothing. Dan walked past the pots. He looked, he sniffed, he tasted. Flavorless broth, meat without a crust, vegetables boiled to a slime. 20 cooks, and not a single one knew how to cook. Because the royal kitchen is a ceremony, not about food. The dishes are beautiful, elaborate, decorated, and completely empty. For the title, not for the people. The king received him that evening. The hall, the throne, the entourage. Dan stood in the middle of the hall in his brown apron and looked at King Velenmar. Not young, thin, pale, tired eyes. His hands lay motionless on the armrests, too motionless, like a man for whom it hurts to move. Dan looked and saw, not the king, a body, a sick body. He asked permission to cook, by himself, in the royal kitchen. One dish, for His Majesty personally. The entourage buzzed. The advisors exchanged glances. It was unheard of. A cook from the front lines is cooking for the king, but the king nodded, wearily, indifferently, like a man who no longer cares. Dan cooked for 2 hours, alone, in the royal kitchen. 20 cooks stood and watched. He paid them no mind. He worked. His hands did the work. He saw the king. He saw his body. Pallor, emaciation, immobility, pain in the joints, dull eyes. This wasn't old age, not fatigue. Poison. Slow. Chronic. Someone had been poisoning the king. For months, maybe years. In small doses, imperceptibly. Dan didn't know what kind of poison, but he knew that a poisoned body needs 2 things: cleansing and strength. Bitterness to get the liver working, fat to bind the toxins, acid to flush it out, heat to warm it from the inside. He made soup, simple, clear, made with bone broth, with bitter herbs he'd brought from the pass, with iris root, with a drop of honey, with thin noodles, nothing extra, nothing fancy. Just soup. For a sick man who'd forgotten that food can heal. The king ate, in the hall, with his retinue, spoonful by spoonful, slowly. He stopped at the 3rd spoonful. He looked at the soup, then at Dan, then back at the soup. He continued eating. Finished. Leaned back on the throne. Closed his eyes. A minute. 2. 3. The entourage froze. Then the king opened his eyes, looked at his hands, raised his right hand. He wiggled his fingers, freely, without pain, for the first time in months. His complexion changed. He didn't look healthy, but the pallor was gone. The spark of life had returned. The king looked at Dan, for a long time. Then he said 2 words. Come again. Dan bowed. He said he wouldn't come, that his place was at the pass, but that he would write a prescription, and that the king needed to find out who was poisoning him. The hall fell silent. The advisors turned pale. One of them, maybe more than one. The king looked at Dan, then he nodded, slowly. And Dan saw understanding in those weary eyes. The king knew. He'd known for a long time. He just couldn't prove it. Now he could. 6 months after the Battle of Cain Dal, the world around him was changing faster than Dan could keep up. The king began a purge. 3 advisors were arrested. The court's chief alchemist had been executed. The poison was in the wine served at dinner. 12 years. For 12 years, the king had been poisoned at his own table. Irony. In a world where a cook, not a poisoner, stood beside the throne. When Dan found out, he sat in silence for a long time. Then he cooked broth. That's his way of thinking. His hands cut, his head works. By royal decree, the 17th Regiment was granted the status of a special unit. Supplies were doubled, reinforcements from volunteers. A separate budget was allocated, small, but separate. For the first time in the history of Velenmar, the military kitchen was listed in official documents as a combat unit. Hollis brought the paper. He placed it on the table in front of Dan. His face was inscrutable. He said he was congratulating him. His voice was even, without mockery, without malice, just even. Then he sat down. He was silent. Then he asked if the cook could make what he had made last time again. For his shoulder. Dan nodded, set down the bowl. Hollis ate, in silence, finished, stood up. At the door, he said, "Cook, when the next fight comes, I'll stand closer to the kitchen. Not because I'm afraid, because it's easier to counterattack from there." Dan understood. Hollis had said in his own way that he would defend the kitchen. In his own way. Not with words, with tactics. Suna returned from the capital with news. After Dan's visit, talk began at court. Not about the cook, about the food, about the army starving, about the supply chain failing, about alchemists charging 1,000 gold pieces for potions, while a cook from the front lines heals the wounded with broth. It was dangerous. The Alchemist Guild won't forgive it. The potion merchants won't forgive it. The quartermasters who steal provisions won't forgive it. Dan had become a threat, not to the enemy, to the system. Suna spoke of this calmly, as if discussing the weather, but her hand rested on the bow she now carried at all times. In the 7th month, Maven found in the forest what Dan had been looking for from day one. A cave. Deep, dry, with a constant temperature. A perfect cellar. A perfect place for fermentation, for storage, for aging. Dan went inside. He walked through the corridors. The walls were stone, smooth. The floor was level. The air was cool, dry. He found 3 chambers, large, high-ceilinged. In one, meat could be stored for months. In another, fermented. In the third, herbs and mushrooms could be dried. He stood in the darkness of the cave and saw a kitchen. Not a shed, a kitchen, a real one, with a pantry, with a cellar, with months' worth of supplies. A fortress that cannot be bought, only burned, and one that would be increasingly difficult to burn. They built it for a month. Dan, Turney, Greer, recovered and limping but stubborn. 10 volunteer soldiers. Maven brought wood from the forest. Aishlin dried the planks with magic. Ha-Yun drew the blueprint. She turned out to be the best architect of them all, because she thought about flow, about how the body moves through space. The infirmary and the kitchen are laid out the same way. Clean, separate from dirty. Hot, separate from cold. Movement in one direction. No crossings, no chaos. The new kitchen. Stone foundation, wooden walls, a tile roof that Greer had knocked out of the wagon. 3 hearths, 2 large cauldrons, 4 small ones, a workbench made of solid oak, shelves, hooks, knives that Dan had ordered from the regimental blacksmith. Real ones, sharp, well-balanced, not restaurant grade, but workhorses. A pantry in the cave, a fermentation chamber, a drying room, a smokehouse in the backyard. Dan stood in the middle of the new kitchen. He looked around. He touched the walls, the table, the knives. He closed his eyes, opened them. It was real. It was his. Ivris appeared in the 9th month. Dan didn't know who she was. A young woman in an officer's uniform. Quiet, polite. She introduced herself as Officer Kalen. She had arrived with reinforcements. Beautiful, delicate, with hands that had never held anything heavier than a pen. With eyes that looked at the world as if through glass. Carefully, without touching. Dan noticed how she ate. In the dining hall, evenly, expressionless. Every bite the same size. Every swallow the same. She wasn't eating food. She was performing a procedure. Like a person who had been fed her whole life by protocol. Dish number 1 for breakfast. Dish number 2 for lunch. Ceremonial, identical, lifeless. No one had ever asked what she liked. Her birthday was in a week. Dan found out by accident. Turney had heard her tell Son A, quietly, in passing, 21. Dan didn't know she was a princess. Didn't know she was the 3rd daughter of that very king. Didn't know she'd been sent to the front so she wouldn't get in the way. He only knew that the young woman had a birthday and that she ate like a machine. That evening he made a dessert, a small one, in a clay pot. Moon turnip cream, sweet, whipped with honey, with a crispy honey crust on top, with berries, warm, soft, simple, like what his mother used to make for the neighbor's girl in his past life. Nothing complicated, nothing formal, just a warm treat for someone who is 21. He set the pot in front of her, silently. Ivris looked, at the pot, at the crust, at the honey, at the berries, then at Dan. Her hands were shaking. She took a spoon, broke the crust, scooped up some cream, brought it to her mouth, ate it. She closed her eyes. Her hands trembled harder. She ate and her hands shook and she couldn't stop. Not because she was hungry, because for the first time in her life, someone had prepared it not for a title, not for a ceremony, not for protocol, for her. For a girl named Ivris, who is 21 years old today. She finished eating, put down the spoon, sat for a minute, two. Then she looked up, teary, red. She looked at Dan, said that she wasn't a Kaelin, that she was Ivris Kaelin, a princess of royal blood, the king's third daughter. She said it and fell silent. She waited, that he would step back, bow, change. Dan looked at her wet eyes, at her trembling hands, at the empty bowl, and he said, "Do you want seconds?" Ivris laughed. For the first time in years, she laughed and cried at the same time, and she nodded. Yes, seconds. Dan went to the kitchen. For seconds. For the princess who wanted not a crown but a warm dessert. A year had passed. Dan stood in the doorway of the new kitchen and looked out over the pass. Morning, fog, smoke from the hearths, the smell of the broth that Turney had put on at dawn. The boy had learned. The broth wasn't golden, but it was honest. Hot, hearty. Dan watched and thought that a year ago he had been lying on the earthen floor of this shed with a wooden spoon in his hand, not knowing where he was, not knowing why, not knowing how. Now he knows. Not everything, but enough. A week ago, Maven found a cave deep in the dark forest. Another one. Not the one that became a storeroom. Deeper, further, in the rock above the river. Inside, a chamber. Stone, round, signs on the walls. Korean, dozens, hundreds. Recipes, notes, ingredient charts, drawings of herbs and mushrooms and meat and fish. Someone lived here, for a long time. Worked, researched, recorded. On the far wall, 2 words in large letters. Han De Song. A name. Dan stood in the cave and looked at the walls, at his ancestors' writing. Because this was his ancestor. He knew. Not by evidence, by blood. The handwriting on the barn wall and the handwriting in the cave were identical. The same slanted lines, the same sweeping circles. Han De Song, Korean, a cook, who ended up on Arelon 70 years ago, missing in the mountains on Earth. Ended up here, like Dan. Just the same. The writings told the story. Not the whole story, in fragments. Han De Song came to this world and began doing the same thing Dan did. Cooking, teaching, feeding. He was better, more experienced. He had more time. He found ingredients Dan didn't know about yet. He created recipes that restored not only the body, but also the seals. He could unlock new levels for warriors through food. This made him the most important person on the continent, and the most dangerous. The Alchemy Guild declared him an enemy. The 4 kingdoms sent assassins. He fled to the dark forest. He hid. He kept working. He wrote it all down. Every recipe, every discovery, everything he knew. On the last wall, the final entry. They found me. I didn't make it in time. But I left the door open. Someone will come. Someone of my blood. Someone who remembers the taste of Solantan. He will finish it. The call. That is what it was. Not a spell. Not magic as they understand it. A culinary testament. Bound by blood and salt, and the last dish that Han De Song prepared before his death. Bound to his blood, to his lineage, to the one who would remember. Dan was his great-grandson. 3 generations later, 2 worlds apart, missing in the mountains of Korea 70 years ago. The family considered him dead. Grandmother told little Dan that his great-grandfather had gone into the mountains and never returned. His mother said he was a cook, a good one. That all that remained of him was a recipe for Sol Lon Tan that no one could replicate. That very Sol Lon Tan, the one Dan had promised to cook for his mother, the one he never got around to. The circle was complete. Dan stood in the cave. He read his great-grandfather's notes, recipes, dozens of them, each more complex than the last, each more profound. Dishes that restored the seals, dishes that cured diseases incurable to alchemists, dishes that brought people back from the brink of death. Not magic, knowledge. An understanding of how food interacts with the body, how taste affects the soul, how the warmth of another's hands in food can do what even the most expensive potion cannot. Han De Song knew more, much more, and he wrote it all down, for whoever comes after. Dan returned to camp, silently. He told no one, except Son A. She listened, calmly, intently. When he finished, she said it changed everything. that with these recipes, he would become more than just a cook. He would become a force, equal to an army, equal to a kingdom. Dan nodded. He knew, and that frightened him, because Hande-sun had become such a force, and he was killed. But Dan wasn't Hande-sun. Hande-sun didn't have what Dan had. He didn't have Turney, who was learning to make broth, Ha-yun, who healed with food, Maven, who brought the impossible from the forest, Aishlin, who kept the pots warm and fell asleep in the kitchen, Sun-ah, who counted and planned and protected, Brenna, who stood in the shadows with her blades, Ivris, who peeled onions with trembling hands and never complained, Grira, who limped but came every morning, Hollis, who placed an empty bowl by the door, Rena, who drank tea in the rain. Hande-sun had no one. He was alone. Dan is not alone. A month after the cave, Dan began to use his great-grandfather's recipes, carefully, one at a time. The first dish for Greer, made from tenebra meat with arris root and 3 herbs that Hande-sun described as the key to repairing damaged muscles. Greer ate. After 3 days, he stopped limping. After a week, he was back in action. Fully. Ha-yun checked his leg. The muscle that had been torn by an arrow had healed, completely. It's impossible without an alchemical potion costing 5,000 gold. Dan did it with soup. Ha-yun looked at the examination results, then at Dan. Then she said he wasn't a cook. Dan replied that he was a cook, just a good one. 1 year and 2 months. Wylock returned, not with an army, alone, under a white flag. He came into the kitchen, sat down at the table, looked at Dan. He said the war was reaching a stalemate, that the Empire was tired, that Velenmar was tired, that soldiers were dying on both sides and the front line wasn't moving. He said he was offering a truce, a real one, not for a month, for a year, to bury the dead, to grow bread, to feed the living. Dan listened. Wylock spoke quietly, without a commander's tone, like a man, like a tired man. Then he fell silent. Dan set a bowl in front of him, soup, with noodles, that very one. Wylock ate, slowly, finished, set down the bowl. Said he would return in a month for the king's answer. Then he added quietly, "Cook, if the war ends, I want to try that pie you and the soldiers." Dan replied that there would be pie, if there is peace. Wylock nodded. He stood up. He left. 3 months later, the armistice was signed. It wasn't a victory. The war wasn't over. An armistice is a pause, a year, maybe 2. Then it would start again. But a year of peace is a year in which no one dies on the pass, a year in which one can sow, build, heal, feed, a year in which children do not go to the front. That is enough. Evening. Kitchen. Everyone is here. For the first time, everyone is at the same table. The long oak table that Greer put together last week. Turney sets out the bowls. Ha-yun cuts the bread. Precisely, evenly, beautifully. Maeve is sitting at the table. At the table. Not against the wall, not on the floor. At the table. Next to Brenna, who is sitting upright and holding her spoon just as Dan taught her. Clumsily, but she's holding it. Ashlyn is complaining that the soup is too hot. Greer is laughing. Misen sits with her back straight, which no longer hurts. Hollis at the end of the table. Silent, but here. Ren next to him. Drinking tea. Sunna across from Dan. Looking at him. Dark eyes. Warm. Warm for the first time. Ivris next to her, eating dessert, smiling, quietly, to herself. Dan stands by the cauldron. He looks at them, at his table, at his family, at the people he found, bowl by bowl, spoon by spoon, broth by broth. He hasn't fought a single battle. He didn't kill a single enemy. He didn't level up. He didn't unlock the seal. He's a cook. He feeds people. And that turned out to be enough to hold the pass, to survive the winter, to live to see the truce, to gather around one table people who used to eat alone before him. He sits down, in his place, at the head of the table, not because he's in charge, because that's where they left him a place, at the head, where the one who cooked sits. Son A lifts a bowl, looks at him, holds it out. The bowl contains porridge, warm, soft, with honey. with a piece of dried fruit resembling an apricot, the very same porridge he used to set before her every morning. Now she has placed it in front of him. Son A says one word: eat. Dan takes the bowl, looks at the porridge, at the honey, at the piece of fruit, at the steam. His hands aren't shaking. His eyes are dry. He brings the spoon to his mouth. He eats. The warmth goes inside. Slow. Soft. Like his mother's hands. Who isn't here, but whom he will find. Here. In these people. In this kitchen. In this world that is slowly learning that food is not fuel. Food is a voice. A voice that says, I see you. In a world where no one sees anyone. He finishes eating. He sets down the bowl. He meets Soon Ah's gaze. She isn't smiling. She never smiles broadly. But the corners of her lips lift slightly, and that is enough. Dan stands up. He walks to the cauldron. Time to make broth for tomorrow. Turney stands behind him, ready to help. Hayun takes a knife. Maven steps out the door. Tomorrow morning she'll bring game. Brenna fades into the shadows by the entrance. Aislinn places her hands on the cauldron. The heat is steady. Gentle. Familiar. Ivris gathers the bowls, silently, carefully. The princess washes the dishes and doesn't complain. Greer tosses wood into the hearth. Hollis places an empty bowl on the shelf. Ren finishes his tea. Soon Ah opens a notebook and writes something down. Maybe numbers, maybe not. The kitchen is bustling. The fire is burning. The broth is boiling. Steam rises to the ceiling and escapes through cracks in the roof into the night sky above the Cane Doll Pass. The inscription on the wall of the old barn stands out in the darkness. Sorry I didn't make it in time to feed you. Dan made it. Not to feed the world, to feed his own. And that was enough. On the wall of the new kitchen, above the hearth, Turney carved another inscription with a knife. Not in Korean, in the language of Erlon, so everyone could read it. 3 words. I'm cooking for you. Dan saw it in the morning. He looked at it, ran his finger over the letters, smiled. He didn't erase it. Let it stay. Let the next cook know. Let everyone who enters this kitchen in a year or 10 or 100 years know. I'm cooking for you. Not food, not a dish, not a recipe. For you, personally. Because you're alive. Because you came. Because I see you. The broth is boiling. Dan picks up a wooden spoon. That very one. The wooden one, blackened by time. The first thing he ever held in his hands in this world. He stirs. He tastes. He adds salt. He tastes again. He nods. Good. Tomorrow morning, 800 people will come to this kitchen with empty bowls. And he will feed them.